Imagine a voice that could command the attention of kings and launch 1,000 ships into battle, a voice believed to carry the very will of the gods. Now picture that same voice, not echoing through marble halls, but fading into the lonely silence of a windswept desert or a forgotten cave. This is the profound paradox of the exiled prophet. These figures were once the most revered and powerful individuals in their societies, the vital link between humanity and the divine, entrusted with the secrets of fate itself. They stood at the very center of their worlds, their pronouncements shaping laws, directing armies, and defining the spiritual life of entire civilizations. Yet, time and again, history and myth show us a startling pattern. These same revered oracles, these truth-tellers, were systematically rejected, silenced, and cast out by the very communities that once exalted them. They held the keys to the future in their hands, yet were denied any place in the present, forced to walk a path from the sacred inner sanctum to the unforgiving outer wilderness. What is it about these seers that inspired such fear? Why do human societies so often build up their prophets, only to tear them down and send them into exile? The journey from oracle to outcast is one of the most haunting and recurring narratives woven through the tapestry of our ancient stories, a narrative that speaks to something deep and often uncomfortable within our own collective psyche. It is a story not just about individuals, but about power, fear, and the difficult relationship we have with truth, especially when that truth is inconvenient, terrifying, or challenges the foundations of our comfortable reality. These myths are far more than simple tales of superstition. They are complex psychological dramas that explore the boundaries of authority, the fragility of faith, and the high cost of speaking knowledge that others refuse to hear. Today, we are embarking on an epic exploration to uncover the untold journeys of these exiled prophets. We will walk with them from their moments of highest influence, seated in smoke-filled chambers where rulers hung on their every word, to their tragic final acts, banished and alone. We will delve into the sacred rituals that granted them their power and the political intrigues that made them targets. We will meet figures like Cassandra, cursed to foresee disaster but never to be believed, and the Sibyl of Cumae, who wished for eternal life only to wither away into a mere whisper. We will analyze the psychological archetypes at play and reveal the startlingly consistent patterns that connect these outcasts across different cultures and millennia. By the end of our journey, you will not only understand the ancient dynamics that turned seers into scapegoats, but you will also begin to recognize the echoes of this ancient pattern in our modern world, in the voices of those who speak difficult truths today. So prepare to question everything you thought you knew about prophecy, power, and persecution as we trace the unforgettable path from oracle to outcast. Picture the scene in ancient Delphi, a woman, the Pythia, seated on a three-legged stool over a fissure in the earth, breathing in ethereal vapors that rose from the ground below. The air is thick with the smell of burning laurel leaves and barley meal, a sacred haze that clouds the chamber. She trembles, her voice deepening, her words becoming fragmented, ecstatic. A priest stands by, ready to interpret her divine ravings for the anxious ruler who has traveled for weeks, desperate for a glimpse into the future. This was not a sideshow attraction. This was the beating heart of the ancient world's decision-making process. An oracle was far more than a simple fortune teller gazing into a crystal ball. They were a vital conduit, a living instrument through which gods and fates communicated their will directly to humanity. Their pronouncements were not mere predictions. They were active forces that could launch 1,000 ships into war, halt a devastating plague in its tracks, or bestow the divine legitimacy a new ruler needed to hold onto power. They operated at the volatile intersection of faith, politics, and cosmic knowledge, making them figures of immense, unparalleled influence. This role took on many different forms across the ancient world. In Greece, the Pythia served as the mouthpiece of Apollo. In Egypt, priests interpreted the dreams of pharaohs, messages believed to be sent from the gods themselves. Further north, in the frozen lands of Siberia, shamans would enter profound trance states, their souls journeying to spirit worlds to retrieve knowledge and healing for their communities. The Celts had their druids, who read the future in the entrails of sacrifices and the patterns of swirling smoke. While their methods differed dramatically from ecstatic possession to astrological calculation to rhythmic drumming, their core function was remarkably consistent. They were the translators of the incomprehensible, the human interpreters of divine intention. They provided a crucial service, offering a semblance of certainty in an overwhelmingly uncertain world, giving people a framework to understand everything from personal misfortune to national crises. The rituals that surrounded their practice were not mere ceremony. They were the essential technology for opening this channel to the divine. The Pythia underwent elaborate purification rites, bathing in the sacred Castalian spring and fasting before her descent into the temple. Siberian shamans would isolate themselves, sometimes for days, using monotonous drumming and dancing to alter their consciousness and prepare for their spiritual journey. These practices served a dual purpose. They were believed to make the prophet a more receptive vessel for divine power, and they also created a powerful psychological and social barrier, elevating the oracle above the common person and reinforcing their unique, untouchable status. The entire process was designed to inspire awe and unquestioning faith, transforming a human being into a temporary avatar of a god. It was this perceived direct line to the ultimate powers of the universe that gave their words such immense weight. When an oracle spoke, it was not a single person offering an opinion. It was, in the belief of the listeners, a deity dictating fate. Understanding this initial, exalted status, the sheer scale of the trust and authority placed upon them is absolutely crucial. It makes their eventual fall from grace not just a simple dismissal, but a catastrophic reversal of fortune, a plunge from the highest pillar of society to the desolate status of an outcast. This foundational role, perched so precariously between the human and the divine, contained the very seeds of their future destruction, making them simultaneously indispensable and, when the winds of favor shifted, tragically expendable. But where did this extraordinary power actually come from? How did a mortal human being become capable of channeling the intentions of the gods or glimpsing the unchangeable threads of fate? The ancient world had a variety of explanations for the source of the oracle's ability, and these perceived origins are absolutely fundamental to understanding their unique position in society. The most widespread and powerful belief was that of direct divine possession. This was not a gentle inspiration but an overwhelming takeover. The Pythia at Delphi was not merely praying to Apollo, she was believed to be physically inhabited by the god himself. His voice used her vocal cords, his thoughts displaced her own consciousness. This was a sacred but terrifying violation of the self, a temporary annihilation of the individual to make room for a cosmic force. The geological oddity of the fissure in the rock, from which intoxicating vapors were said to rise, provided a tangible, physical explanation for this metaphysical event. The earth itself was breathing a divine madness into her, making the abstract concept of possession frighteningly real for those who witnessed her convulsions and heard her distorted, otherworldly utterances. This model of power, as an external force seizing control of a passive vessel, was crucial. It meant the oracle's own mind, her own opinions and biases, were theoretically removed from the equation. The message was pure, untainted by human fallibility, because the human had been temporarily erased. Other traditions bypassed a specific deity and attributed prophetic power to a deep, self-induced trance state that allowed the seer's spirit to travel to other realms of knowledge. Siberian shamans, for instance, would use relentless, rhythmic drumming, frenetic dancing, and sometimes powerful psychoactive plants derived from local fungi to systematically dismantle their ordinary awareness. The goal was to enter a non-ordinary reality, a hidden dimension where time was not linear and information from the past, present, and future coexisted. In this state, they could commune with spirit animals, consult with ancestral guides, and diagnose the spiritual causes of illness or social strife. Similarly, some Vedic seers in ancient India used complex meditation and breath control to achieve states of heightened consciousness where they were said to perceive the fundamental fabric of the universe. Here, the power was not about being spoken through, but about achieving the mental and spiritual clarity to see what was always there, just hidden from everyday perception. The rituals of fasting, sleep deprivation, and sensory overload were not punishments. They were tools to break down the walls of the mundane self and access a more profound, universal wisdom. A third compelling source of prophetic authority found in myth is the idea of a hereditary gift, a power that ran in the blood. This concept presents prophecy not as a state to be achieved through ritual or granted by a god, but as an inborn and often unwelcome trait. The most famous example is the family of Seers in Greek myth, descended from the nymph Melampus, who could understand the language of all animals after snakes licked his ears clean. This gift was passed down through his lineage, creating a kind of prophetic dynasty. This notion of a cursed bloodline adds a layer of tragic inevitability to the prophet's role. They did not choose their power, it was their birthright and their burden. They were set apart from birth, marked by a destiny they could not refuse. This hereditary model could grant a different kind of legitimacy, the authority of tradition and lineage, but it also stripped the individual of any personal agency. They were a prophet not by merit or divine favor in that moment, but by the accident of their birth, a fate that could feel as much like a prison as a privilege. What unites these diverse sources, possession, trance, and heredity, is a critical common thread. The power was never seen as the oracle's own personal skill or intellectual accomplishment. A prophet was not considered a genius of deduction or a brilliant analyst of political patterns. They were a conduit, a hollow bone through which a greater wind blew. Their authority depended entirely on this external attribution. This is the central, brilliant, and ultimately tragic paradox of their position. On one hand, this belief made them utterly irreplaceable and their words unimpeachable. To disagree with the Pythia was not to disagree with a woman from a local village. It was to disagree with the god Apollo. This divine backing is what gave their pronouncements the force to start wars and depose kings. Yet, on the other hand, it created a profound psychological distance between the prophet and their community. They were not a respected elder offering wise counsel. They were a temporary container for a terrifying alien power. They were a tool, an instrument, and what happens to a tool when it is no longer needed, or worse, when it begins to produce results that are inconvenient or frightening? It is set aside, replaced, or broken. This very mechanism that granted them ultimate authority, the complete separation of the mortal messenger from the divine message, is what made their eventual rejection so effortless. When the powerful needed to silence a troublesome truth, they didn't have to attack a god. They could simply discredit or dispose of the human vessel, the one part of the equation that was fragile, mortal, and vulnerable. The divine source of their power, which once lifted them to the highest peak of influence, ironically laid the groundwork for their devastating fall, highlighting the cruel fate of being a mortal punished for delivering an immortal truth. Yet for all their divine authority and the awe they inspired, no prophet, no matter how revered, remains unchallenged forever. The pedestal they stood upon was always a precarious one, built not on stone but on the shifting sands of human faith. The first signs of trouble often appeared as a subtle, almost imperceptible crack in this foundation, a single moment of doubt that, once seeded, could slowly widen into a chasm of disbelief. This initial skepticism rarely arrived as a dramatic public denouncement. More often, it began as a quiet whisper in the royal court, a nervous glance exchanged between temple priests, or the private disappointment of a commoner whose fervent prayers, guided by an oracle's word, went unanswered. The very nature of prophetic power, which thrived on mystery and ambiguity, contained the ingredients for its own undoing. In a world craving certainty, the riddles and conditional statements that oracles were famous for could suddenly feel less like divine wisdom and more like a clever hedge, a way to avoid being proven definitively wrong. A prophecy that promised a great victory, if a brave heart leads the charge, could, after a catastrophic defeat, be reinterpreted as a condemnation of the king's courage rather than a fault in the vision itself. This inherent flexibility, once seen as a mark of profound depth, could be recast as a manipulative loophole, the first thread pulled that would eventually unravel the oracle's cloak of invincibility. One of the most famous and poignant examples of this fatal misunderstanding comes from the story of King Croesus of Lydia, a tale that perfectly captures how a single failed interpretation could shatter an oracle's credibility. Croesus, one of the wealthiest men in the ancient world, was contemplating a preemptive war against the rising Persian Empire. Being a prudent ruler, he decided to test the various oracles of the known world before committing his armies. He sent messengers to the 7 most famous oracles, including Delphi, with a specific instruction. On the 100th day after their departure, they were to ask the oracle what King Croesus was doing at that very moment back in Lydia. The messengers recorded the responses and returned. The Pythia at Delphi was the only one to get it spectacularly right, delivering a verse that described Croesus boiling a tortoise and a lamb together in a bronze cauldron, an bizarre and uniquely specific act that the king had indeed performed to stump the Seers. Convinced of Delphi's unparalleled connection to Apollo, Croesus then posed his real question: should he wage war on the Persians? The oracle gave a response that has echoed through history as a masterpiece of ambivalence, that if Croesus attacked the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Overjoyed and filled with confidence, Croesus mobilized his forces and marched to war, only to be utterly defeated. The great empire he destroyed was, in fact, his own. The prophecy had been technically accurate, but its delivery was a trap of language and expectation. Croesus heard what he wanted to hear, and the oracle's phrasing allowed for that fatal misinterpretation. When the dust settled and Croesus faced capture and near execution, his faith was broken. He sent a message to Delphi, reproaching the god for his misfortune. The priestess's reply was a chilling lesson in accountability. Apollo had delivered what was asked, a true vision of the future. It was Croesus who failed to ask the follow-up question, who failed to seek clarity on which empire would fall. The god, she stated, could not even be blamed for the timing, as he had granted a 3-year delay of the disaster, which Croesus had failed to recognize. This entire episode, while justifying the oracle from a theological perspective, had a devastating impact on its public perception. For any skeptical observer, it was a clear case of a ruler being led to ruin by a cleverly worded prediction. The story of Croesus became a cautionary tale not just about hubris, but about the potential perils of relying on the ambiguous words of seers. It demonstrated that an oracle's infallibility depended entirely on the fallible interpretation of mortals, and when those interpretations led to catastrophe, it was the oracle's reputation, not the listener's understanding, that often paid the price. Beyond these dramatic misinterpretations, the seeds of doubt were also sown by the very political systems that oracles served. A prophecy was never delivered into a vacuum. it landed in a complex web of rivalries, ambitions, and factional intrigues. When an oracle's pronouncement conveniently legitimized one noble family's claim to the throne over another's, it was only a matter of time before the losing side began to question the vision's authenticity. Whispers would circulate that the priestess had been bribed, that the interpreting priests were in the pay of a rival, or that the entire ritual had been staged for political theater. The oracle, intended to be a neutral conduit of the divine, would find itself accused of being a pawn in a very human game of power. This political skepticism was perhaps even more dangerous than the kind born of a failed prediction. A wrong forecast could be explained away as a misunderstanding or the result of insufficient sacrifices, but an accusation of political corruption struck at the very heart of the institution's legitimacy, suggesting the sacred channel to the gods was not just occasionally fuzzy, but fundamentally polluted by human greed and ambition. The faith of the people was predicated on the idea of a pure, unbiased divine message. Once that purity was questioned, the oracle transformed from a sacred institution into just another political actor, and one whose power made it a supremely dangerous and therefore necessary target for neutralization. This phase, the first crack of doubt, is the critical turning point in the prophet's journey. It is the moment the community's gaze shifts from one of reverent awe to one of scrutinizing assessment. The oracle is no longer a flawless mirror reflecting the divine will, but a human institution that can be flawed, manipulated, or simply mistaken. The unwavering faith that allowed their words to shape destiny begins to fracture, replaced by a cautious, even cynical hesitation. This erosion of trust is a quiet but relentless process. It doesn't topple the statue in one blow, but it carefully removes the foundation, piece by piece, until the structure becomes unstable, waiting only for the right moment, the right piece of bad news or political pressure to send it crashing down. The emergence of skepticism marks the end of the oracle's untouchable status, initiating a dangerous reevaluation that would ultimately pave the road from the inner sanctum directly into the desolate wilderness of exile. There comes a point in every prophet's story where the abstract power of foresight collides violently with the concrete realities of power. After the first cracks of doubt have appeared, the stage is set for the defining crisis, the moment when the oracle is compelled to deliver a message so stark, so threatening to the established order that it cannot be ignored, it can only be violently rejected. This is not a forecast about a distant harvest or a personal fortune. This is a fateful prophecy, a divine verdict that strikes at the very heart of a kingdom's stability or a leader's legitimacy. The prophet, bound by a sacred duty that transcends personal safety, becomes the bearer of an unwelcome truth, a living embodiment of a future that those in charge are desperate to avoid. The message they carry ceases to be a helpful guide and transforms into a direct indictment, a challenge so profound that the only possible response from the threatened establishment is to destroy the messenger. Consider the agonizing position of Cassandra within the walls of Troy, blessed or perhaps cursed with the gift of perfect foresight by the god Apollo. She saw with chilling clarity the doom that the giant wooden horse would bring. She smelled the smoke of her burning city before a single fire was lit. She heard the future screams of her family and friends while they were still laughing and celebrating what they believed was a Greek surrender. Yet her curse ensured that no one would ever believe a word she said. When she ran through the streets, her hair wild, her eyes wide with a horror only she could perceive, she was dismissed as a madwoman. Her own father, King Priam, likely saw her not as a seer but as a source of embarrassment and hysterical disruption. Her truths were not just inconvenient, they were psychologically intolerable. To believe Cassandra would have meant accepting the imminent and total annihilation of their entire world. a cognitive leap so terrifying that it was far easier to label her insane. Her prophecy was the most unwelcome truth imaginable, and the Trojans, unable to process it, exiled her from the sphere of rational discourse long before the city fell. These fateful pronouncements often took the form of a direct threat to a ruler's throne. A classic example from the Hebrew Bible is the prophet Nathan confronting King David. After David had orchestrated the death of Uriah the Hittite to cover up his adultery with Bathsheba, Nathan came to him and told a clever, heart-wrenching parable about a rich man who stole a poor man's only beloved lamb. David, enraged by the injustice in the story, declared that such a man deserved death. Nathan then delivered the chilling, straightforward punchline, "You are that man." In that moment, Nathan was not offering a vague prediction. He was holding up a mirror to the king's own corruption and murderous actions. He revealed a hidden sin and pronounced a divine judgment that would bring calamity upon David's own house. This was an incredibly dangerous act. Nathan's prophecy was a direct challenge to the king's authority and moral standing, an accusation that, if heeded, would force a humiliating public reckoning. That Nathan survived the encounter is a testament to David's own complex character, but it perfectly illustrates the immense risk a prophet took when their message was one of personal condemnation for a powerful ruler. For every Nathan, there were countless other seers whose similar accusations led not to royal repentance, but to a swift and permanent silencing. Other times, the unwelcome truth was a warning of systemic doom that the ruling class had a vested interest in denying. The prophet Jeremiah spent decades warning the kingdom of Judah of impending destruction at the hands of the Babylonians if they did not abandon their corrupt ways and return to their covenant with God. His was not a message of hope or easy redemption, but one of relentless, looming catastrophe. He spoke against the king's policies, against the false prophets who promised peace, peace, when there was no peace, and against the comfortable illusions of the political and religious elite. His prophecies threatened the entire economic and social structure of the nation. To the powerful, Jeremiah was not a patriot but a traitor, a defeatist whose very words were sapping the nation's morale. He was seen as undermining the war effort, and for delivering this unbearable vision of the future, he was imprisoned, thrown into a muddy cistern, and ultimately forced into exile in Egypt. His story shows that an unwelcome truth is often not just about a single event, but about the collapse of an entire way of life, a revelation so disruptive that the system must expel the person who gives it voice. The psychological dynamic at play in these moments is a brutal form of killing the messenger. The human mind has powerful defense mechanisms for dealing with information that causes anxiety or threatens our core identity. When a prophet declares that a beloved king will fall, that a proud city will be rubble, or that a hidden transgression has been seen by the gods, they are injecting a massive dose of cognitive dissonance into the community. The people are faced with a choice. They can accept the terrifying new reality presented by the prophet, which would require a painful upheaval of their beliefs and actions, or they can reject the prophet. Rejecting the prophet is psychologically much easier. By discrediting, mocking, imprisoning, or exiling the seer, the community can resolve the dissonance. They can tell themselves, the problem is not our king, nor our city, nor our sins. The problem is this troublesome individual who speaks lies and sows discord. The prophet becomes a scapegoat for the community's own unacknowledged fears and guilt. The act of delivering the unwelcome truth is the trigger that transforms the oracle from a valued, if occasionally misunderstood, advisor into a political and psychological liability. It is the point of no return, the event that crystallizes all the simmering doubts and fears into a single, decisive conclusion. This voice must be removed for the comfort and survival of the group. The prophecy itself becomes the very reason for the prophet's downfall. creating the tragic irony that their greatest moment of clarity and courage is what ultimately seals their fate and sets them on the lonely path to exile. This sacred connection to the divine, which placed the oracle at the center of spiritual life, also placed them squarely in the crosshairs of earthly ambition. Their temple was not an isolated sanctuary, but a stage for some of the most consequential political dramas of the ancient world. A king did not merely seek an oracle's wisdom for personal enlightenment. He sought a divine stamp of approval for his reign, his wars, and his dynasty. This made the prophet's voice a political instrument of immense value, a prize to be controlled, manipulated, or, if it could not be controlled, eliminated. The very fact that their authority came from a source beyond the palace walls made them simultaneously indispensable and infuriatingly independent to the ruling class. A monarch could command armies and levy taxes, but he could not command a god. He could only hope to influence the human being who served as that god's mouthpiece. This precarious balance of power meant that from the moment an oracle rose to prominence, they were never truly safe from the machinations of those who saw their influence not as a spiritual gift, but as a rival form of power. Consider the immense weight carried by a single endorsement from a place like Delphi. When a hopeful claimant to a throne made the long pilgrimage to consult the Pythia, he wasn't just asking for a prediction, he was seeking legitimacy. A positive response from Apollo's oracle could rally noble families to his cause, convince a hesitant army to follow him, and frame his ascent as a matter of divine will rather than mere ambition. Conversely, a negative or ambiguous prophecy could doom a reign before it even began, providing his enemies with a powerful propaganda tool. This placed the oracle and their priests under tremendous pressure. It was an open secret in the ancient world that the great oracular sites were not immune to the lure of bribes or the threat of political retaliation. While we have no direct evidence of the Pythia herself being bribed, historical records strongly suggest that the priests who interpreted her often rambling utterances could be swayed by generous donations to the temple or by geopolitical alliances that benefited their home city-state. The line between divine will and political convenience could become dangerously blurred, transforming the sacred rite of prophecy into a sophisticated tool of statecraft. This political entanglement created a double bind for the prophet. If their visions consistently aligned with the interests of the powerful, they risked being seen as a mere puppet, their divine authority slowly eroding into a cynical public relations arm of the state. Yet, if their visions directly contradicted the ruler's agenda, they instantly became a threat. A king planning a war of expansion did not want to hear a prophecy of defeat. A queen consolidating her power did not want to be told her lineage was cursed. When an oracle delivered such an inconvenient truth, they were no longer just a spiritual advisor. They were a political dissident armed with supernatural backing. Their words could incite rebellion, undermine public confidence, and provide a rallying point for opposition factions. In the eyes of a threatened ruler, silencing such a prophet was not an act of impiety but a necessary act of national security. The exile or execution of a seer was, in this cold political calculus, simply the removal of a dangerous rival who commanded a loyalty that transcended earthly authority. The competition wasn't only with kings and generals. Often, the most immediate threat to an oracle came from within the religious establishment itself. Established priestly castes who derived their own power from complex rituals and hereditary roles could view a charismatic, independent prophet with deep suspicion and envy. These institutional priests controlled vast temple economies funded by donations and sacrifices. A popular seer who drew crowds and devotion away from the official state temples was not just a spiritual phenomenon, they were a direct economic competitor. Every person who traveled to hear the lone prophet in the desert was someone not offering a sacrifice at the official altar. thereby reducing the temple's income and influence. This dynamic is vividly illustrated in the biblical confrontation between the prophet Elijah and the 450 prophets of the god Baal, who were supported by Queen Jezebel. This was not merely a theological debate, it was a high-stakes showdown for the religious allegiance of the kingdom, with profound political and economic consequences for the ruling house and the established priestly class. Elijah's victory on Mount Carmel led directly to the execution of the royal prophets, making him a mortal enemy of the queen and forcing him into a period of desperate flight and exile. His story is a powerful testament to how independent prophetic authority could be perceived as a direct threat to a state-sanctioned religious monopoly. The most tragic cases are those where the oracle attempted to remain truly independent, only to be crushed between two warring political factions. During the Peloponnesian War, the city-state of Athens was deeply divided. A plague had ravaged the population, and the war against Sparta was going poorly. In this atmosphere of fear and desperation, the political climate grew toxic. The Athenian leader Pericles, who had championed a strategic navy-based defense, faced fierce opposition. While there is no single recorded oracle that condemned him, the historical climate shows how religious pronouncements were weaponized. His political opponents would have eagerly seized upon any prophetic utterance that could be interpreted as a criticism of his leadership, using it to turn public opinion against him. An oracle who valued their integrity might try to remain neutral, but in such a polarized environment, neutrality itself could be seen as an act of opposition. Refusing to endorse the state's official policy could be framed as treason, and delivering a vision that comforted the enemy, even unintentionally, was a capital offense. In this light, the exile of a prophet was often the final move in a long and subtle game of political chess. It was a calculated, cold-blooded strategy to neutralize a center of influence that could not be controlled, ensuring that the only voice shaping the destiny of the state would be the one emanating from the throne itself. Once the decision was made to remove a prophet, the machinery of discredit would swing into motion, and the accusations leveled against them were as predictable as they were devastating. The most common and damning charge was fraud, the claim that the oracle was nothing more than a clever charlatan, a master of deception who had been manipulating the fears and hopes of the populace for their own ends. This accusation fundamentally reframed the prophet's entire life's work. Those ecstatic trances were no longer divine possession, but a carefully rehearsed performance. Those ambiguous riddles were not profound mysteries, but deliberate obfuscations designed to never be proven wrong. The immense wealth that often flowed into a major oracle's temple was suddenly reinterpreted not as pious donation, but as the ill-gotten gains of a massive, long-running con. This charge was so effective because it tapped into a very human suspicion of those who claim special knowledge. It allowed the public to feel not like faithful devotees who had been betrayed by the gods, but like savvy individuals who had finally seen through a clever trick. The narrative shifted from a complex theological failure to a simple story of a crook getting their comeuppance, a story that was far easier for the average person to digest and support. A more spiritually terrifying accusation was that of blasphemy. If the charge of fraud suggested the prophet was a mere fake, the charge of blasphemy suggested something far darker, that their power was real, but its source was demonic, profane, or utterly alien to the accepted pantheon. This was the ultimate way to sever the oracle's connection to the divine. The argument went that the prophet was not channeling Apollo or any legitimate god, but was instead consorting with chthonic spirits, vengeful ghosts, or foreign deities considered monstrous by the community's standards. The Pythia's sacred vapors, perhaps they were a poison from the underworld, not a gift from the sun god. The shaman's spirit journey, maybe he was trafficking with malevolent forces that demanded terrible sacrifices. This accusation was particularly potent because it played on a deep, primal fear of spiritual pollution. It suggested that the entire community had been unknowingly participating in a corrupted rite, that their prayers had been directed not to heaven but to some abyssal power. By branding the prophet a blasphemer, the authorities could frame the exile not as a political purge, but as a necessary act of communal purification, a holy duty to cleanse the land of a spiritual poison. In the Greek world, a third, more philosophical accusation often emerged: hubris. This was not simple pride, but the specific, catastrophic sin of overstepping the fundamental boundary between mortal and divine. A prophet accused of hubris was not just a fraud or a heretic, they were a rebel against the cosmic order itself. The charge suggested that the oracle had begun to believe their own press, that they had forgotten they were merely a vessel and had started to act as if they were the source of the power. They were not just speaking for the gods; in their arrogance they were acting as if they were a god. This was a profound transgression in a worldview that depended on a clear hierarchy. The story of Tiresias is touched by this theme. While his blindness was a punishment for seeing a goddess naked, it represents the danger of mortals accessing divine secrets. For a community, exiling a prophet for hubris was a way of reasserting that proper order. It was a dramatic declaration that no human, no matter how gifted, could ever truly bridge that gap, and that any who tried must be cast out to preserve the balance of the universe. The punishment was a lesson for all, a reminder of humanity's proper, humble place in the grand scheme of things. These accusations, whether of fraud, blasphemy, or hubris, served a vital psychological and social function beyond their legal purpose. They were the necessary tools for scapegoating, a process that allowed a community to transfer its own collective anxieties, guilt, and failures onto a single, symbolic figure. The prophet, who had once been the community's link to divine favor, now became the explanation for divine displeasure. A lost war, a failing harvest, a devastating plague. These calamities could now be blamed not on poor leadership or collective moral decay, but on the corrupting influence of the false oracle in their midst. By transforming the revered seer into a monstrous fraud or a blaspheming witch, the community could achieve a powerful catharsis. They could project all their unresolved fears and self-doubt onto this one individual and then, through the act of exile, literally cast those troubles out beyond the city walls. The public branding and ritual humiliation were essential parts of this process. It wasn't enough to quietly send the prophet away. The community needed to see them denounced, stripped of their status, and broken. This spectacle served to unite the people against a common enemy, reinforcing social bonds that may have been frayed by the very crises the prophet had foretold. The legal pretext for exile was therefore just the final, formal step in a much deeper social ritual, one designed not just to punish an individual, but to heal a community's fractured identity by collectively agreeing on a single, simple source for all their complex problems. But the downfall of a prophet was almost never a solo performance orchestrated by a single villainous king. For an exile to truly stick, for a voice to be permanently silenced, it required something far more powerful and insidious: the collective will of the community itself. The ruler might sign the decree, but it was the whispers in the marketplace, the turned backs in the temple, and the growing chorus of public outrage that truly built the walls of banishment. This shift from reverence to rejection is one of the most fascinating and unsettling aspects of the entire cycle, revealing how an entire society can turn against a figure it once held sacred. To understand this, we need to look beyond palace intrigues and delve into the complex social psychology of the crowd, a process that transforms a community from a group of devoted followers into a unified mob demanding expulsion. At the heart of this transformation lies a powerful and ancient mechanism known as scapegoating. The prophet, who once served as a unifying symbol of divine connection, gradually becomes a focal point for all of the community's pent-up anxieties, unspoken fears, and unresolved conflicts. When a crisis hits, a drought, a plague, a military defeat, the human mind desperately searches for a cause, a reason for the suffering. It is psychologically easier to blame a single, tangible source than to grapple with the chaotic, complex, and often random nature of misfortune. The oracle, with their strange behaviors and unsettling messages, presents a perfect target. They are already set apart, already other. By collectively agreeing that the problem is them, the problematic truth-teller, the group can achieve a powerful, if temporary, sense of catharsis. Casting out the prophet becomes a symbolic act of purging the community's ills. It creates a clear narrative. We were pure. This corrupting influence entered our midst. We have identified and removed it, and now order and divine favor will be restored. This ritual sacrifice of the seer allows the community to restore its sense of unity and shared identity, but it does so by creating a common enemy. This process rarely happens spontaneously. It is almost always carefully cultivated through the spread of rumors and the deliberate manipulation of public opinion. Following a failed prophecy or the delivery of an unwelcome truth, whispers begin to circulate. Did you hear, someone might say, that the Pythia was seen accepting a gift from that foreign ambassador? Or, they say the prophet's trance isn't real, it's just an act put on after consuming a special mushroom. These rumors don't need to be proven, they simply need to be repeated. They plant seeds of doubt that grow in the fertile soil of collective anxiety. Political factions that feel threatened by the oracle's influence will often fuel these rumors, using their resources and networks to amplify the negative narrative. They might employ town criers or sympathetic poets to reframe the prophet's past successes as lucky guesses and their ambiguities as evidence of deception. The language used to describe the seer begins to change. The term divinely inspired is replaced with hysterical. The mysterious becomes the deceptive. This slow, steady poisoning of the public well is essential. It transforms the prophet in the popular imagination from a revered authority into a dangerous fraud or a blaspheming heretic, making their eventual exile feel not like a tragedy, but like a necessary and just act of communal self-defense. The most heartbreaking part of this entire spectacle is watching the very people who once queued for hours to seek the oracle's wisdom now stand in the public square and call for their banishment. These are the same farmers who begged for rain, the same merchants who sought advice on their ventures, the same mothers who prayed for healthy children. Their turning is the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Why do they do it? Beyond the rumors and manipulation, there is a deeper, more uncomfortable psychological driver at play. The prophet's very existence becomes a living reproach. Every time the community sees the seer, they are reminded of the uncomfortable truths they would rather forget. The warning they ignored, the corrupt king they tolerate, the moral compromise they have made. The prophet's presence forces a level of cognitive dissonance that is simply too painful to maintain. To resolve this internal conflict, the masses must convince themselves that the messenger is false. By joining the cry for exile, they are not just banishing a person, they are banishing their own guilt and fear. They are collectively agreeing to stop looking in the mirror the prophet so relentlessly holds up. This collective action demonstrates that exile is far more than a simple legal punishment. It is a profound social ritual, a ceremonial cleansing designed to reaffirm the group's boundaries and restore a fragile sense of comfort by violently ejecting the one element that most challenges it. Once the verdict was delivered and the community's collective will turned against the prophet, the act of banishment itself became a meticulously staged public drama, a ritual of profound symbolic power. This was never a quiet slipping away under cover of darkness. It was a civic spectacle, a performance designed to be witnessed and remembered by all. Imagine the scene in a Greek city-state. The accused prophet, once adorned in sacred vestments, now stands in the central agora, surrounded by a murmuring crowd. A herald representing the ruling authority steps forward and unrolls a scroll, his voice cutting through the air to recite a formal decree of exile. This public proclamation was crucial. It transformed a political decision into an official, legal fact, witnessed by the entire community. The words themselves acted as a kind of spell, severing the prophet's legal and social identity in front of the very people who had once sought their counsel. In other traditions, the expulsion was more visceral and immediate. A seer might be violently dragged from their temple sanctuary by guards, their sacred space defiled by the very worldly power it was meant to transcend. This physical removal from the spiritual heart of the community was a powerful message. The gods have rejected you, and so have we. Your voice no longer holds sway in this holy place. For the prophet, this violent ejection was not just a physical injury, but a deep spiritual wound, a brutal disconnection from the divine source they served. The rituals that accompanied this banishment were laden with symbolic meaning, each action carefully designed to dismantle the prophet's former identity and status. One of the most common acts was the stripping of their ceremonial robes or ritual regalia. A staff, the symbol of their authority and their connection to the divine, might be snapped in two before the crowd. The elaborate headdress or sacred jewelry that marked them as a vessel of the gods was forcibly removed. This was a systematic undoing of their sacred persona. Where once they were clothed in the vestments of power, they were now left in simple, common garb, or sometimes in rags, visually reduced to an ordinary, powerless mortal. This public humiliation served to reinforce the new narrative. The divine power was never truly within them. It was merely a costume they wore, and now the costume has been taken back. In some cultures, the ritual went even further. There are accounts of a symbolic cleansing of the community, where the city gates or temple threshold were ritually scrubbed with water or blood after the prophet passed through, as if washing away the spiritual contamination their presence had caused. The community, by performing this act, was not just casting out an individual. They were purifying themselves, drawing a stark, visible line between the ordered world inside the walls and the chaotic wilderness to which the outcast was now condemned. The destinations chosen for these exiles were themselves deeply symbolic, reflecting the profound otherness now assigned to the prophet. The most common landscapes were the desert, the mountain, or the deep forest places that existed beyond the boundaries of cultivated, civilized life. The desert represented a void, a place of purification through absolute emptiness and exposure, where the prophet would confront the raw elements without the buffer of society. The mountain was a place of isolation and lofty, dangerous closeness to the divine, a paradoxical return to the source of their power that was also a sentence to unbearable solitude. The dark, untamed forest was a liminal space of chaos, transformation, and unknown perils, where the normal rules of human conduct did not apply. Sending a prophet to such a place was a way of saying, "You belong with the formless, the wild, the uncontrollable. The order we have built here has no place for you." This geographical symbolism reinforced the social and spiritual death the community was enacting. The prophet was not just being sent away, they were being returned to the primordial chaos from which civilization had emerged, their banishment a reenactment of humanity's struggle to impose order on a frightening world. Ultimately, the moment of exile served a dual purpose for the society orchestrating it. On one hand, it was a powerful display of state authority, a warning to any who might challenge the established order. The public spectacle demonstrated that the king, the council, or the priesthood held the ultimate power to define who belonged and who did not, who could speak and who must be silenced. It reinforced the social boundaries of the community by vividly illustrating the fate of those who transgressed them. On the other hand, it provided a profound psychological release for the populace. By collectively witnessing the fall of the prophet, by participating in the ritual through their presence and their silence, or their shouts, the community achieved a sense of catharsis and renewed unity. The complex anxieties and moral ambiguities that the prophet represented were physically cast out, allowing the group to believe that harmony and divine favor had been restored. The lonely figure disappearing into the wilderness carried with them the collective sins, doubts, and fears of the people they left behind. The ritual of banishment was therefore not merely a punishment, it was a foundational act of social self-definition, a brutal but effective way for a community to heal its fractures by agreeing on a single, shared enemy and ceremoniously ejecting them from their world. To truly understand the exquisite torment of Cassandra's position, we must first look at the origin of her gift, a story that reveals just how perilous the relationship between a mortal and a god could be. According to the most common version of the myth, the god Apollo, captivated by Cassandra's beauty, sought to win her favor. In a gesture of divine courtship, he bestowed upon her the gift of prophecy, a power that should have elevated her to the highest echelons of influence. Yet, after receiving this incredible ability, Cassandra spurned the god's advances. Enraged by this rejection, Apollo could not revoke a power he had already given, as divine gifts were considered irrevocable. Instead, he twisted it. He leaned in and breathed a curse upon her, ensuring that while she would always see the future with perfect, unerring clarity, no one who heard her would ever believe a single word she said. This is the foundational paradox of her existence, a blessing that became a prison, a voice of absolute truth condemned to eternal, frantic silence. Her curse was not a simple case of bad luck. It was a meticulously crafted punishment, a divine mechanism that perfectly weaponized her own insight against her, transforming her greatest asset into the source of her ultimate isolation and despair. Now picture the sheer psychological horror of her daily life within the gilded walls of Troy. While her family and the citizens of the city went about their lives in blissful ignorance, Cassandra alone was burdened with a relentless, waking nightmare. She didn't just have a vague premonition of danger, she saw the fall of Troy in vivid, cinematic detail. She foresaw the Greek warriors hidden inside the wooden horse, their armor clinking softly in the darkness. She smelled the acrid smoke of her beloved city burning, a scent that haunted her long before the first torch was ever lit. She heard the future screams of her brothers as they were cut down, and she witnessed the brutal fate that awaited her mother and sisters. This knowledge was not a gentle warning. It was a torturous certainty that played out in her mind over and over again, a film of impending doom that she was forced to watch on a continuous, inescapable loop. Her curse ensured that this unbearable vision was hers and hers alone to bear, a solitary burden that severed her from the shared reality of everyone around her. The celebrations, the laughter, the sense of security, all of it was a cruel illusion that she could not partake in, making her a ghost at the feast, a specter of doom haunting the halls of her own home. Her attempts to warn her people were, of course, exercises in futility that only deepened her misery. When the Trojans first discovered the massive, mysterious wooden horse left on their shore, they saw it as a trophy, a symbol of their victory and the Greek surrender. But Cassandra saw it for what it was, a trick, a tomb, the instrument of their annihilation. She would have run through the streets, her voice cracking with desperation, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with a terror only she could comprehend. She would have pleaded with her father, King Priam, and her brother, Hector, to see the truth. She would have clawed at the wooden flanks of the horse, screaming that death lurked within. But to the Trojans, her frantic warnings were not the pronouncements of a seer. They were the ravings of a madwoman. The divine curse translated her perfect truth into what sounded like hysterical nonsense. Her family, embarrassed and perhaps even frightened by her outbursts, likely had her restrained, dismissed from the council chambers, and kept away from important guests. This is the core of her unique form of exile. She was not cast out beyond the city walls into the physical wilderness. Instead, she was exiled to a desolate landscape within the very heart of her community. She was a prisoner of their disbelief, trapped in a gilded cage where her screams for reason were heard only as proof of her insanity. The response of her family and the Trojan people is a masterclass in the psychology of denial. To have believed Cassandra would have required them to accept a reality so terrifying that it was simply unthinkable. It would have meant admitting that their hard-won war was not over, that their greatest enemy was not sailing away but was hidden in plain sight, and that their entire civilization was hours away from total destruction. The cognitive dissonance was too immense. It was far easier and psychologically safer to believe that the problem was Cassandra herself, that she was unstable, irrational, or cursed, than to accept the cataclysmic truth she presented. Her own father, who likely loved her, was faced with an impossible choice: trust the seemingly incoherent ramblings of his daughter, or trust the apparent evidence of a Greek retreat and a divine offering. The curse made the choice for him. By framing her truth as madness, Apollo's punishment ensured that the Trojans would become active participants in their own downfall. They were not merely duped by the Greeks, they were complicit, their refusal to listen to the one person who saw clearly being the final, fatal step in the trap that was sprung upon them. Cassandra's isolation was therefore complete. She was not only unheard, but her very sanity became the cornerstone of the city's collective delusion. Her ultimate fate, after the city was sacked exactly as she had foretold, adds another layer of profound tragedy to her story. She did not escape the doom she predicted. She was captured by the Greek king Agamemnon and taken back to Mycenae as a prize of war. In a final, cruel twist of irony, her prophetic vision remained intact. She foresaw Agamemnon's own murder upon his return home, as well as her own death at the hands of his vengeful wife Clytemnestra. So, even in her captivity, the relentless horror of her foresight continued. She was marched away from the smoldering ruins of her home, a living witness to the total validation of every warning she had ever issued, yet still utterly powerless to alter the course of events. Her physical exile from Troy was merely the final act in a life defined by a much deeper, more agonizing form of banishment. Cassandra's narrative stands as perhaps the most pure and heartbreaking expression of the exiled prophet archetype. Her story teaches us that exile is not always a journey across a geographical map. Sometimes the most devastating banishment is to be stranded on an island of truth in a sea of collective disbelief, forever howling into a wind that carries your voice away from every listening ear. While Cassandra's tragedy was one of being trapped within her own society, the story of the Sibyl of Cumae reveals an even more profound and chilling form of banishment. Her exile was not from the city walls, but from the very essence of what it means to be human. In Roman mythology, immortalized by the poet Virgil, the Sibyl was the fearsome prophetess who presided over a sacred cave near the city of Cumae in Italy. It was she who served as the guide for the hero Aeneas, leading him on his terrifying descent into the underworld to meet the shade of his father. Her authority was immense. Kings and heroes trembled before her, and her cryptic prophecies written on oak leaves could dictate the fate of nations. Yet the source of her ultimate torment lay not in a curse from a spurned god, but in a terrible, foolish wish she made in her youth, a wish that Apollo was all too happy to grant. The pivotal moment that defined her eternal suffering was a simple bargain struck with the god Apollo. Captivated by her beauty, the god offered her anything she desired in exchange for her favors. The Sibyl, perhaps thinking herself clever, pointed to a heap of dust on the ground and asked for as many years of life as there were grains of dust she held in her hand. Apollo immediately agreed, granting her this immense longevity. But in her haste or her pride, she made a catastrophic oversight. She had asked for eternal life, but she had forgotten to ask for eternal youth to accompany it. This was the cruel genius of the mythic bargain. The gods were notorious for granting the literal letter of a wish while completely subverting its spirit, and Apollo, slighted by her rejection, ensured her punishment would fit her request perfectly. She would live for 1,000 years just as she had asked, but she would not remain the vibrant, powerful priestess she was. Instead, she was condemned to experience the relentless decay of her own body, a slow, agonizing process that would strip her of her physical form while her consciousness endured, trapped within a prison of her own making. As the centuries crawled by, the Sibyl's fate unfolded with gruesome inevitability. She did not simply grow old gracefully, she shrank and withered away. Her skin became like parchment, her bones as brittle as dried twigs. The vibrant woman who once commanded the attention of heroes gradually transformed into a tiny, desiccated husk. Later Roman writers like Petronius described her most haunting state, kept in a jar or ampulla, suspended within her sacred cave, her body so shriveled that she was little more than a disembodied voice. When children visited her and teasingly asked, "Sibyl, what do you want?" her only reply was a whispered, haunting refrain, "I want to die." This image is one of the most powerful in all of classical literature. The jar represents her ultimate confinement. She is no longer a person inhabiting a world, but a specimen preserved, a curiosity isolated from all physical sensation and human contact. Her voice, once the instrument of divine prophecy, is reduced to a single, pathetic expression of an impossible desire. Her power, which was meant to connect her to the cosmos, has instead severed her from everything that gives life meaning: the touch of another, the warmth of the sun, the simple passage of days that lead to a natural end. This is the core of her metaphysical exile. She is an outcast not from a geographical location, but from time itself and from the human condition. While mortal communities are defined by their cycles of birth, growth, decay, and death, the Sibyl is stuck in a horrifying loop of endless decay without the release of death. She witnesses generation after generation rise and fall around her. The city of Cumae, which once revered her, might have crumbled into ruin. The people who knew her name turned to dust, their descendants forgetting the ancient voice in the cave. She becomes a living fossil, utterly divorced from the flow of history and human connection. Her irrelevance is a form of social death that precedes her physical one. Where Cassandra was isolated amid a crowd, the Sibyl is isolated by the relentless march of time, a spectator to the entirety of human transience from which she is permanently barred. Her existence becomes a profound contradiction. She is alive, yet she has outlived every context that gave her life purpose and meaning. The Sibyl's story serves as a devastating cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of seeking power without wisdom. Her desire was for ultimate knowledge and influence over the long arc of history, a wish to transcend the mortal limits that constrain human understanding. But in achieving this, she lost everything that makes knowledge valuable. What is prophecy without an audience to hear it? What is foresight without a community to warn or a future to shape? Her prolonged existence, divorced from the mortal community she was meant to serve, becomes the very source of her ultimate powerlessness. She sought to become like the gods, but she discovered that immortality without the other attributes of divinity, agelessness, vitality, and purpose, is not a blessing but the most exquisite form of torture. Her narrative stands as a stark warning against the hubris of seeking to transcend our natural boundaries, reminding us that the very things that define our humanity, our fragility, our fleeting time, our connections to others, are not limitations to be escaped, but the essential ingredients of a life worth living. In the end, the Sibyl's journey illustrates that the most terrifying wilderness is not a desert or a mountain, but an endless, lonely stretch of time, where one can fade away into a mere echo long before the body is finally, mercifully allowed to rest. The story of Tiresias introduces a different kind of wilderness, one that exists not beyond the city gates but in the very heart of the community itself. His is an exile of proximity, a state of being physically present yet socially and emotionally untouchable, a living paradox whose greatest insight came from his physical blindness. The myths surrounding his loss of sight are themselves profound. In one version, he stumbled upon the goddess Athena bathing naked, and as a consequence was struck blind. In another, more complex tale, he witnessed two snakes mating and after striking them was transformed into a woman. Years later, encountering the same event, he was transformed back into a man. Later, Zeus and Hera, arguing over which gender experienced more pleasure in love, called upon Tiresias as the only mortal who could claim knowledge of both. When he sided with Zeus, stating that women experienced pleasure 10 times more than men, the enraged Hera struck him blind. As compensation for this loss, Zeus granted him the gift of prophetic sight and a lifespan stretching 7 or even 9 generations. This origin story establishes the core theme of his entire existence. His blindness was a direct punishment for witnessing a truth that was forbidden, for knowing something the gods wanted to keep hidden. His physical condition was not a random affliction but a permanent, visible marker of his transgression, a constant reminder that he had seen too much and paid the ultimate sensory price. Yet, in a stunning reversal, this very punishment became the source of his power, his lack of physical vision forcing an inward turn that opened his mind to the unseen currents of fate. This duality is perfectly, painfully illustrated in his most famous appearance within the tragic cycle of Oedipus the king. The city of Thebes is gripped by a terrible plague, a divine punishment festering at the core of the state. King Oedipus, the celebrated riddle solver, sends for the blind prophet Tiresias, believing he holds the key to identifying the pollution causing the city's suffering. The scene that unfolds is one of the most electrically charged confrontations in all of literature. Oedipus, the man of action and logic, demands answers. Tiresias, the man of inner vision, resists, knowing the horror his words will unleash. He begs Oedipus to send him home, telling the king how terrible it is to know when nothing good can come of knowing. He understands that the truth he carries is not a cure but a poison, and he initially chooses a form of self-imposed silence rather than be the agent of catastrophe. But Oedipus, in his arrogant certainty, will not be denied. He pressures, cajoles, and finally, in a burst of fury, accuses Tiresias of being the mastermind behind the murder of the previous king, Laius. It is only under this torrent of abuse and false accusation that Tiresias unleashes the full, shattering truth. He tells Oedipus point blank that he himself is the murderer he seeks, the pollution of this land, and that he is living in the most foul and unnatural relationship, blind to the fact that he has married his own mother. The prophet's physical blindness becomes a devastating rhetorical weapon. He tells the raging king, "You have your sight, and do not see what evil you are in. You do not see in what a flood of evil you are swimming." In this moment, Tiresias embodies the ultimate irony. The blind man sees the truth with crystalline clarity, while the king, with perfect physical vision, is utterly blind to the monstrous reality of his own life. Oedipus, of course, responds not with gratitude for the truth but with volcanic rage. He hurls insults, mocking Tiresias's blindness and accusing him of being a fraud in league with Oedipus's political rival, Creon. This verbal abuse is a form of social banishment. Oedipus, the embodiment of state power, is not just rejecting a message. He is attempting to strip the prophet of his authority, his dignity, and his very place in the civic conversation. He exiles Tiresias from the realm of rational discourse, treating him not as a revered seer but as a malicious and senile old man. This dynamic reveals the cruel, transactional relationship society often has with its truth-tellers. The community, in this case represented by Oedipus, desperately needs the prophet's unique knowledge in a crisis. They rely on him to diagnose the spiritual sickness, to point the way toward salvation. Yet, the moment his diagnosis implicates them, the moment the truth points a finger at the powerful or forces a painful self-reckoning, that reliance curdles into hostility. Tiresias was summoned as a solution and was immediately treated as the problem when his solution required the king's downfall. He was central to the city's survival, yet marginalized for speaking the words that made that survival possible. He was respected for his power, a resource to be tapped in an emergency, but shunned for the devastating implications of that power. His existence on the margins of Theban society was not an accident but a necessity. A figure who held such uncomfortable, destabilizing truths could not be fully integrated into the polite, orderly functioning of the court. He was a walking, talking embodiment of the repressed secrets and moral failings that the state was built upon, a constant, silent accusation that had to be kept at arm's length, only to be dragged into the light when all other options had failed. The physicality of Tiresias's blindness serves as a powerful, enduring metaphor for this social condition. In a society that prized physical beauty, strength, and visible status, his sightless eyes and need for a young guide to lead him through the city made him appear weak and dependent. This physical otherness made it easier for people like Oedipus to dismiss him. His blindness was a visible flaw that could be mocked, a tangible excuse to disregard the inconvenient truths he spoke. Yet within the myth, this physical limitation is precisely what granted him his true vision. Unable to be distracted by the superficial appearances of the world, he was forced to develop an inner sight, an ability to perceive the hidden architecture of fate, the divine laws that governed human actions, and the moral rot that festered beneath a polished surface. His social isolation mirrored this physical state. Just as he was cut off from the visual world, he was cut off from the full embrace of the community. He was heard but not heeded, consulted but not cherished, a tool rather than a trusted advisor. He was, in essence, the conscience of Thebes, listened to in moments of panic, but otherwise ignored, because a constant, active conscience is an unbearably inconvenient thing to have around. Tiresias thus stands as the ultimate symbol of the prophet who is punished for his knowledge, not through a single act of banishment, but through a lifelong sentence of being present yet perpetually unseen. His greatest insights born from the very condition that made his world so small and his social exile so complete. The world of the ancient Hebrew prophet presents a stark and powerful contrast to the ecstatic, trance-induced oracles of the pagan world. While the Pythia at Delphi was a temporary vessel for a god's voice, her own identity momentarily erased, the Hebrew prophet was called into a deeply personal, often agonizing, relationship with a single sovereign God. This was not a temporary possession but a permanent vocation, a relentless burden placed upon an individual who remained fully conscious and accountable. Figures like Jeremiah and Ezekiel were not sought out by kings for a quick divine consultation. They were compelled by a divine call to stand against kings, to confront their own people with a message they did not want to hear. Their authority did not come from a sacred geological fissure or a hallucinogenic brew, but from a moral covenant, a binding agreement between God and the nation of Israel that demanded justice, righteousness, and faithfulness. This fundamental shift in the source of prophetic power redefined the prophet's entire mission. They were no longer mere fortune-tellers predicting isolated events. They became the nation's living conscience, a role that guaranteed their persecution and forged a unique form of internal exile, a feeling of profound estrangement from the very community they were trying to save. The life of Jeremiah, often called the weeping prophet, is a masterclass in the cost of this vocation. His call was direct and terrifying. God told him he had been chosen for this task even before he was born. Jeremiah's immediate response was to protest, echoing a common theme among these figures. "I do not know how to speak, I am too young," but the divine calling was inescapable. For decades, he delivered a singular, unwelcome message to the kingdom of Judah: surrender to the rising Babylonian Empire. This was not a prediction of a distant possibility, but a direct command based on his understanding of God's will. He argued that the Babylonians were God's instrument of judgment against Judah's social injustice, idolatry, and hollow religious rituals. Unsurprisingly, this message was treasonous in the eyes of the political and religious establishment. To the king and his advisors, Jeremiah was a defeatist, a collaborator, and a threat to national morale. For his troubles, he was beaten, put in stocks, and threatened with death. The most vivid symbol of his rejection came when he was thrown into a muddy, empty cistern, sinking into the mire at the bottom, left to die. This was more than just imprisonment. It was a symbolic burial, an attempt to physically silence the voice of dissent by casting it down into a pit of filth and forgetfulness. His rescue was a minor miracle, but it did not end his torment. He was forced to witness the very catastrophe he had foretold: the siege of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the massacre of its people, and the exile of its survivors. Jeremiah's physical suffering was matched only by his profound emotional agony, his famous laments revealing a man torn apart by his love for his people and his unwavering duty to deliver a message of their doom. Ezekiel, a prophet among the first wave of exiles in Babylon, experienced a different yet equally potent form of isolation. His call to prophecy was spectacular and bizarre, involving visions of strange wheels within wheels and four-faced living creatures. But it was the nature of his prophetic actions that truly set him apart and exemplified his role as a walking, talking symbol of his people's condition. God commanded him to perform a series of deeply strange and deeply personal symbolic acts. He was instructed to lie on his left side for 390 days to symbolize the years of Israel's sin, and then on his right side for 40 days to represent Judah's iniquity. He was told to bake his bread over a fire fueled by human excrement to illustrate the defiled food the Israelites would eat in exile. He was commanded to not mourn publicly when his wife, the delight of his eyes, suddenly died, as a sign that the people would be so stunned by the destruction of the temple that they would be unable to grieve properly. These acts were not just performances, they were a form of embodied prophecy, a way of internalizing the national trauma and making it physically manifest. In performing these bizarre commands, Ezekiel made himself a social outcast even among his fellow exiles. He became a spectacle, a madman in their eyes, someone to be avoided and pitied. His exile was not just geographical, stranded in a foreign land. It was a profound psychological and social separation, enforced by the very methods God required him to use to communicate his message. This points to the core of the Hebrew prophet's unique form of banishment, the internal exile. While a figure like Cassandra was physically trapped within Troy, the Hebrew prophet was often free to walk the streets but was utterly alone in a crowd. Their estrangement stemmed from a radical disconnect in values and purpose. They were called to be a conscience, and a conscience, by its very nature, is an internal critic that speaks against comfortable complacency and popular sin. When the entire nation, from the king to the commoner, was engaged in practices the prophet condemned, whether it was oppressing the poor, worshipping foreign gods, or placing their trust in political alliances instead of God, the prophet's voice became a constant, irritating reminder of their collective failure. They were not just delivering bad news, they were accusing their neighbors, their family, their leaders of moral and spiritual bankruptcy. This created an unbridgeable chasm. The prophet could not participate in the national celebrations because he saw the hypocrisy behind them. He could not endorse the royal policies because he saw the injustice they perpetuated. He was a stranger in his own homeland, a citizen whose loyalty to a higher law made him an alien among his own people. This internal wilderness was perhaps a more desolate place than any physical desert, a landscape of loneliness where the prophet's only company was the demanding, uncompromising voice of the God who had called him. The starkest difference between the Hebrew prophet and the pagan oracle lies in the framework of the covenant. The pagan oracle operated in a world of capricious gods and unpredictable fate. The Pythia's words were often ambiguous riddles because the future itself was seen as a shifting, uncertain thing, influenced by sacrifice and chance. In contrast, the Hebrew prophet spoke from within the context of a clear historical agreement, the covenant between Yahweh and Israel, established with figures like Abraham and Moses. This covenant was not a mystery, it was a known set of laws and ethical demands. Therefore, the prophet's message was rarely a cryptic prediction about an unknowable future. Instead, it was a prosecuting attorney's closing argument based on the clear terms of a broken contract. If you obey, you will be blessed, the covenant stated. If you disobey, you will be cursed. The prophet's role was to stand before the nation and declare, "You have disobeyed, and therefore the curses are coming." This transformed prophecy from fortune-telling into a call for ethical and spiritual accountability. The future was not fixed by blind fate. It was the direct and predictable consequence of present actions. The prophet's conflict with the establishment, therefore, was not merely a political disagreement, it was a lawsuit. The prophet was suing the nation on God's behalf for breach of contract, and the ruling class, the kings and priests who benefited from the status quo, were the defendants. In this divine courtroom, the prophet was both the witness and the prosecutor, a role that ensured his message would be contested with every fiber of the nation's being, casting him out into the cold solitude of being right, but being right all alone. But exile is not always a final destination. Sometimes it is a profound transformation, a crucible that forges the palace oracle into a very different kind of figure, the wandering sage. This evolution represents a dramatic shift in the prophet's relationship with power and truth. Stripped of their formal title, their temple, and their place in the established hierarchy, they are forced to carry their authority within themselves, wearing it not in fine robes but in the dust on their sandals and the clarity of their untethered words. No longer speaking from a sanctioned throne or a smoke-filled chamber, their new pulpit becomes the open road, the dusty crossroads, or the quiet clearing where a handful of curious listeners might gather. This new nomadic existence, while born from the trauma of banishment, can paradoxically become a form of liberation, freed from the need to flatter kings, appease wealthy patrons, or conform to the rigid doctrines of a state priesthood. The exiled prophet is finally at liberty to speak a purer, more unvarnished form of truth. Their authority undergoes a fundamental metamorphosis. It no longer derives from an institution's endorsement but from their perceived authenticity, their radical detachment from worldly power, and the raw, uncompromised wisdom that seems to flow directly from their experience of loss and survival. We see this archetype emerge with stunning clarity in the ancient Greek world with the rise of the peripatetic philosophers, most notably Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes was not a prophet in the traditional sense of delivering divine pronouncements, but he was very much a truth-teller, an exile who transformed his banishment into a powerful philosophical stance. He lived not in a temple but in a large ceramic jar in the marketplace of Athens. He owned nothing, desired nothing from the powerful, and famously roamed the city with a lantern in broad daylight, claiming he was searching for an honest man. His entire life was a performance, a deliberate and shocking rejection of the very social conventions and political structures that had likely led to his exile in the first place. When Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the known world, came to visit him and offered to grant him any wish, Diogenes, who was sunbathing at the time, simply replied, "Stand out of my sunlight." This was not the plea of a desperate outcast, but the declaration of a man who had found a power greater than any army, the power of complete independence. By having nothing to lose, he gained everything: the freedom to speak the blunt, often uncomfortable, truth to anyone, regardless of their status. His wandering, impoverished existence was not a mark of his failure, but the very source of his immense moral authority, proving that a sage without a home could be more influential than a king on his throne. This pattern repeats itself across cultures, revealing a universal human recognition of wisdom untamed by institutions. In India, the tradition of the sad, who presents a powerful parallel. These are holy men who renounce all worldly attachments, family, wealth, and social position, to embark on a lifelong pilgrimage. They wander from one sacred site to another, living on alms, their bodies often smeared with ash and their minds focused on spiritual liberation. While not all sadhus are prophets, their role in society often overlaps with that of the wandering sage. They are sought out for counsel precisely because they exist outside the rigid caste system and the material concerns of everyday life. Their perceived purity, born from extreme austerity and detachment, gives their words a weight that a household priests might lack. They have voluntarily exiled themselves from ordinary society to pursue a higher truth, and in doing so, they become living symbols of that truth, their very presence a silent sermon on the impermanence of worldly power and the possibility of a different kind of wealth. Their wisdom is not found in a sacred text alone, but is etched into their weathered skin and reflected in their calm, observant eyes, a testament to a knowledge earned through radical freedom and relentless travel. This transformation from exiled prophet to wandering sage reveals a crucial psychological and spiritual insight. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that has been unmoored from any fixed address. When the prophet is cast out from the center, their message is forced to travel, to adapt, and to find new soil in which to take root. The truths they speak are no longer the official pronouncements of a state religion, sanitized and curated for political convenience. Instead, they become a kind of spiritual folklore passed from traveler to traveler, shared in hushed tones at a campfire, or debated by students who have left their cities to follow this mysterious teacher on the road. This form of transmission is inherently more democratic and often more potent. It cannot be controlled by a central authority. It is wisdom that has gone feral, and in its wild state, it often retains a vitality and authenticity that its domesticated temple-bound counterpart has lost. The wandering sage, therefore, embodies a profound paradox. Their banishment becomes the very condition for their greatest influence. Stripped of every external validation, they are forced to discover an authority that resides solely in the integrity of their character and the resonance of their words, proving that a prophet without a temple can sometimes build a cathedral in the human heart that is far more enduring than any structure of stone. But to truly grasp the violent rejection these figures faced, we must journey beyond the throne rooms and temple squares and into the hidden landscapes of the human mind itself. Why is it that the human psyche, both as individuals and as a collective, possesses such a powerful, almost reflexive, urge to silence its most insightful seers? The answer lies not in ancient superstition, but in the fundamental ways our minds protect themselves from truths that are too painful to bear. From a modern psychological perspective, the prophet becomes far more than a simple messenger. They transform into a living embodiment of the community's own repressed shadow self. This concept, introduced by the pioneering psychologist Carl Jung, refers to the parts of our own personality that we deny, suppress, and refuse to acknowledge: our hidden fears, our unspoken shames, our secret aggressions, and our most uncomfortable truths. These elements don't disappear, they are simply shoved into the dark basement of the unconscious. The prophet, through their uncanny and uncompromising visions, effectively marches into the town square, throws open the basement door, and drags these repressed contents kicking and screaming into the blinding light of day. When Cassandra foretold the fall of Troy, she wasn't just predicting a military defeat. She was giving voice to the Trojans' own deep, unspoken anxieties about their pride, their vulnerability, and the potential consequences of their actions. The community, confronted with this mirror of its own hidden fears, does not thank the messenger. Instead, it reacts with the fury of someone whose deepest secrets have been exposed, seeking to shatter the mirror rather than face the unsettling reflection staring back. This dynamic operates on a massive, cultural scale through what Jung termed the collective unconscious. This is the idea that beneath our personal psyches, we all share a deep, inherited layer of the mind containing universal archetypes and latent memories common to all humanity. The collective unconscious of a society holds its shared traumas, its foundational myths, and its ingrained patterns of behavior. The prophet, in their role, often taps directly into this volatile reservoir. They articulate the anxieties and moral failings that the entire group feels but has silently agreed never to discuss. When a Hebrew prophet like Jeremiah condemned the economic exploitation of the poor and the hollow performance of religious rituals, he was voicing the collective guilt that an entire society was carrying but actively ignoring. By exiling or silencing Jeremiah, the community wasn't just getting rid of a troublesome critic. They were performing a kind of psychic surgery, attempting to cut out and discard the part of their own collective mind that contained this painful self-knowledge. The act of banishment becomes a desperate, symbolic ritual of repression on a grand scale, a way to reject the uncomfortable contents of their shared unconscious and pretend they never existed. This process is supercharged by another powerful psychological force known as cognitive dissonance. This is the profound mental discomfort we experience when we hold two or more conflicting beliefs, ideas, or values at the same time. A king who sees himself as a just and divinely favored ruler will experience intense cognitive dissonance when a prophet tells him his reign is corrupt and doomed. A populace that believes its city is blessed and impregnable will suffer tremendous psychological stress when a seer describes its walls crumbling to dust. The human mind craves consistency and will go to extraordinary lengths to reduce this dissonance. The easiest and most common way to do this is not to change one's behavior or beliefs, which is difficult and painful, but to discredit at the source of the conflicting information. By labeling the prophet a fraud, a madman, or a blasphemer, the king and the people can resolve their internal conflict. They can tell themselves, "The problem is not my unjust rule, but the liar who speaks against it. The problem is not our city's vulnerability, but the madwoman who invents tales of doom." The prophet's unwavering certainty makes them a perfect target for this. Their lack of doubt refuses to accommodate the community's preferred, more palatable worldview, forcing a dissonance that can only be resolved by eliminating the messenger. The exile is, therefore, a defense mechanism for the collective ego, a way to preserve a fragile self-image by destroying the one person who most threatens it. This explains the puzzling, often irrational violence that is so frequently directed at these truth-tellers. The rage is not proportional to a simple disagreement. It is the fury of a wounded psyche. The prophet is not just an opponent, they are a living reproach, a walking, talking embodiment of everything the community is trying to hide from itself. The hatred directed at them is the hatred we feel for the parts of ourselves we most despise and fear. When the community turns on the prophet, they are engaging in a form of psychological projection, taking their own internal shadows, their guilt, their fear, their shame, and casting them out onto a single external figure. This act of scapegoating provides a temporary but powerful sense of relief. By uniting against a common enemy and violently ejecting them, the group achieves a catharsis. They can believe for a moment that they have purified themselves, that the badness has been removed, and they can return to their comfortable illusions. The physical exile of the prophet is simply the external, ritualized enactment of this internal, psychological process. It is the community's desperate attempt to tear down the mirror that reflects its flaws, a tragic testament to the immense difficulty of facing uncomfortable truths about who we are, both as individuals and as a society. The haunting stories of Cassandra and Tiresias might feel like distant echoes from a world of myth, but their struggles are far from over. The archetype of the exiled prophet has not vanished with the temples of Delphi. It has simply put on a modern suit, traded the sacred tripod for a laptop or a laboratory, and stepped onto the global stage. Today, the journey from Oracle to Outcast continues, playing out in the lives of whistleblowers, dissident scientists, and activist artists who dare to voice truths that disrupt our comfort and challenge our power structures. These contemporary seers do not inhale volcanic vapors to receive their visions. Their prophecies are built from meticulously gathered data, first-hand accounts of corruption, or powerful artistic expressions that hold up a mirror to society's flaws. Yet, the consequences they face, a form of social and professional exile, are strikingly familiar to the fates of their ancient counterparts, proving that our collective aversion to disruptive truth is a deeply ingrained human pattern, not a relic of a superstitious past. Consider the climate scientist, a modern-day Cassandra armed with complex climate models instead of divine possession. For decades, these researchers have been compiling overwhelming evidence of a planetary crisis, their reports and predictions forming a clear and terrifying prophecy of environmental collapse, rising sea levels, and extreme weather events. Their message is as unambiguous as it is unwelcome, demanding a fundamental restructuring of our economies and lifestyles. And just like the Trojan princess, they have been met with a wall of disbelief and deliberate dismissal. Powerful interests with a stake in the status quo have orchestrated sophisticated campaigns to sow doubt, branding these scientists as alarmists, frauds, or political pawns. Their credibility is attacked, their research is misrepresented, and their urgent warnings are often ignored by the very policymakers who hold the power to act. This is not a physical banishment to a desert, but a form of intellectual exile where their crucial insights are pushed to the margins of public discourse, deemed too inconvenient and too costly for the political arena. The mechanism is the same. When the truth is too frightening to accept, we first try to discredit the one who speaks it. In the corporate world, the whistleblower plays the role of the prophet who dares to reveal the hidden sins of the kingdom. These are individuals who, often at immense personal risk, expose fraud, safety violations, or systemic corruption within powerful organizations. They are the internal oracles who see the rot at the core and feel compelled to speak out, just as the Hebrew prophets condemned the moral decay of their own society. The modern equivalent of being thrown into a cistern, however, is a swift and brutal process of professional annihilation. They face immediate termination, blacklisting within their industry, and protracted legal battles designed to bankrupt and break them. Their character is systematically assassinated. They are painted not as truth-tellers but as disgruntled, unstable, or treacherous employees. Social media often becomes the digital equivalent of the public square, where they are vilified by anonymous mobs and branded as traitors. This comprehensive destruction of their career and reputation is a potent form of exile, casting them out from the professional community they once belonged to and leaving them isolated in a wilderness of financial precarity and legal strife, all for the crime of revealing an uncomfortable reality. Activist artists, too, channel the spirit of the exiled prophet, using their creative work as a vessel for uncomfortable social commentary. Through powerful imagery, provocative performances, or searing music, they give form to the collective anxieties and injustices that society often prefers to ignore. They are the wandering sages of our time, their art serving as their lonely pulpit. And just like the prophets of old, when their message challenges a powerful ideology or a dominant cultural narrative, they are met with fierce backlash. Their funding is revoked, their exhibitions are cancelled, and they are subjected to vicious online harassment campaigns designed to silence their voice. This is a cultural exile, an attempt to banish their perspective from the mainstream and render their art invisible. The goal is not just to punish the individual, but to send a chilling message to others who might be tempted to speak similarly disruptive truths, reinforcing the boundaries of acceptable expression in a way that would have been perfectly understood by any ancient king seeking to control his court seers. What makes this modern echo so chilling is the sheer precision with which the ancient mechanisms of rejection are replicated. The first step is always doubt, just as King Croesus questioned the oracle's ambiguity. Today, this takes the form of manufactured skepticism and misinformation campaigns that cloud clear scientific consensus or factual evidence. Next comes the accusation, the modern equivalent of charging a prophet with fraud or blasphemy. The whistleblower is labeled a criminal, the scientist is accused of data manipulation, the artist is smeared as a propagandist. Finally, there is the silencing, the ultimate goal of this entire process. This is achieved not with a royal decree of banishment, but through career destruction, legal intimidation, and social ostracism, effectively exiling the truth teller from their professional and social communities. This recurring pattern demonstrates that the impulse to shoot the messenger is not a flaw of ancient thinking but a fundamental and persistent feature of human psychology and social organization. We are still that Trojan court, desperately wanting to believe the wooden horse is a gift, and we are still willing to dismiss the one voice screaming that it is a trick. Recognizing this unbroken thread connecting the mythic past to our complex present does more than just make these ancient stories relevant. It provides us with a crucial lens through which to understand the high-stakes conflicts over truth, power, and silence that are defining our world today. This deep and fundamental tension between our longing for certainty and our terror of it lies at the very heart of why the prophet's journey so often ends in exile. Think about the world these ancient people inhabited, a place of sudden plagues that could wipe out a city, of droughts that could starve a kingdom, of wars that erupted from distant insults and shattered entire civilizations. In the face of such overwhelming, random chaos, the human psyche reaches for anything that can impose a sense of order and predictability. The oracle, sitting in their sacred chamber, offered exactly that. They were a fixed point in a swirling storm of uncertainty, a divine anchor. By consulting the Pythia or reading the entrails of a sacrificial animal, a ruler wasn't just seeking advice, he was performing a profound psychological act. He was attempting to transform the terrifying, formless unknown into a manageable, knowable future. The prophecy, even if it was a riddle, gave him something to hold onto, a narrative to follow. It replaced the agony of not knowing with the comfort of a plan, however ambiguous. This craving for certainty is not some ancient superstition. It is a basic human drive that continues to this day. We check our weather apps obsessively. We devour economic forecasts. We take personality tests that promise to map out our future careers, all in a desperate attempt to shrink the vast, intimidating landscape of what might happen into a neat, navigable path. Yet, this desperate craving contains a terrifying trap, because the certainty we so desire can quickly curdle into a prison. The oracle's power doesn't just reveal the future, it can also reveal our own profound powerlessness within that future. Imagine a king who is told, in no uncertain terms, that his firstborn son will die in a battle next spring. suddenly, the comforting illusion of control is shattered. Every decision he makes from that moment on is shadowed by this grim knowledge. Does he send his son to the front lines, fulfilling the prophecy and proving the oracle right? Or does he keep him locked in the palace, only for the prince to die in a freak accident within its walls, still proving the oracle right? The prophecy becomes an inescapable box. It strips the king of his agency, transforming him from an active shaper of his destiny into a passive actor reciting lines in a play whose ending is already written. This is the dark side of certainty. It can feel less like a guide and more like a sentence. The future is no longer a field of possibilities where his choices matter. It is a pre-carved stone tablet, and he is merely the chisel that must follow the grooves. The very thing he sought to ease his anxiety, the absolute knowledge of what is to come, now becomes the primary source of his dread, a constant, gnawing reminder that he is not the author of his own story, but a character trapped within it. This is where the psychological pivot happens, where the revered oracle becomes the resented outcast. The human mind has a remarkable capacity for what is known as cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when we hold two conflicting ideas at once. In this case, the conflict is between the king's self-image as a powerful, autonomous ruler and the crushing reality of his powerlessness in the face of fate. To resolve this agonizing dissonance, his mind searches for a simpler, more palatable explanation. It is far easier to believe that the problem is not the prophecy itself, but the person who delivered it. The messenger becomes the focus of all his frustration, fear, and rage. He begins to think, if not for this prophet and their terrible words, I would be free. I would have hoped my son's fate would not feel so sealed. The prophet's existence becomes a living reproach, a walking, talking embodiment of the king's own limitations. By exiling or silencing the seer, the king is not just punishing a person. He is performing a symbolic act of rebellion against the entire concept of a fixed, unpleasant future. He is in effect trying to shatter the stone tablet and reclaim the liberating, if terrifying, uncertainty of the open field. He chooses the anxiety of not knowing over the despair of knowing a terrible truth, because uncertainty, at least, contains the fragile seed of hope. This conflict creates a deeply hypocritical, yet entirely human, relationship with prophetic knowledge. We do not want the truth. We want a specific kind of truth, one that confirms our biases, validates our ambitions, and assures us of our safety and success. A prophecy of victory, wealth, and long life is welcomed with open arms and generous donations to the temple. It is framed as divine favor, a confirmation that we are on the right path. But a prophecy of defeat, poverty, or death is immediately suspect. It is questioned, rationalized, and ultimately rejected as the work of a fraudulent or blasphemous mind. We are like patients who only want a doctor's diagnosis if it tells us we are healthy. If the news is bad, we fire the doctor and go searching for a second, third, and fourth opinion until we find one that tells us what we want to hear. This selective acceptance of certainty reveals that our desire is not for knowledge itself, but for comfort. The oracle is only valuable as long as they serve as a dispenser of comfort. The moment they become a source of discomfort, a mirror reflecting back our deepest fears and flaws, their utility vanishes, and they transform from an asset into a liability that must be removed. Ultimately, the exile of the prophet is a tragic attempt to reset the clock, to return to a state of innocence before the burdensome knowledge was ever imposed. It is a collective act of pretending. By casting the truth-teller out into the wilderness, the community can collectively agree to unknow what they have been told. They can point to the empty space where the prophet once stood and say, "See, the problem is gone. The words they spoke were lies. We are free again." This is the final, desperate illusion, the belief that by destroying the mirror, you can change the reality it reflects. the community trades the harsh clarity of a difficult truth for the comforting fog of willful ignorance. They reclaim the anxiety of an open future because within that anxiety, there is still room for their own agency, for miracles, for exceptions, for the unpredictable twists of fortune that might just save them. The prophet's plight, therefore, is sealed by this impossible position they occupy. They are asked to be the bearers of certainty in an uncertain world, but they are only tolerated when that certainty feels like a blessing. The moment it feels like a curse, they are sacrificed on the altar of our own fragile hope, their banishment a stark testament to the fact that humanity's thirst for knowledge has very strict and very selfish limits. So what becomes of the words of an exiled prophet after the dust has settled and the voice that spoke them has been silenced? The journey of a prophecy does not end at the city gates. In many ways, that is only its beginning. Once the immediate, living threat of the truth-teller has been removed by banishment or death, a remarkable process of cultural digestion begins. The very community that once recoiled from the prophet's message starts to cautiously, almost unconsciously, revisit their words. The painful, disruptive truths that were impossible to stomach in the heat of the moment are now examined from a safe distance, filtered through the clarifying lens of hindsight. The prophecy, once a blazing fire that threatened to consume the established order, is allowed to cool into the embers of memory where it can be carefully tended, reshaped, and ultimately repurposed for the community's own needs. This transformation from a live, dangerous pronouncement into a safe, static legend is the final, fascinating stage in the life cycle of the exiled seer. A process where society finally makes peace with the truth by first neutralizing the one who delivered it. Consider the powerful mechanism of hindsight, which acts as a kind of cultural alchemist, transmuting the lead of past rejection into the gold of revered wisdom. When a prophet stands in the public square and warns of a coming plague, they are an alarmist, but when the plague actually arrives exactly as foretold, their words are no longer a frightening prediction, they become a profound insight. The community, now living in the reality the prophet described, looks back and sees not a madman, but a clear-eyed visionary. Their exile is no longer a necessary act of political hygiene, but a tragic mistake, a catastrophic failure to listen. This retrospective reevaluation allows the society to process its collective guilt and shame. By posthumously rehabilitating the prophet as a martyr or a saint, the community can atone for its past sins without having to actually face the discomfort of the prophet's living presence. The outcast is welcomed back into the fold, but only symbolically as a statue, a name in a holy book, or a character in a folktale. This is a safe form of reconciliation. It allows everyone to agree that the prophet was right, but only after the fact, when the hard work of changing their behavior or challenging their leaders is long past. The prophet's victory is entirely posthumous. They win the argument, but they are not around to enjoy it or to demand further, more difficult changes. This repackaging of prophecy into legend serves several crucial cultural functions. First, it creates a foundational narrative for the community, a story of a past failure that reinforces present values. The tale of Cassandra becomes a timeless lesson about the perils of arrogance and the importance of listening to dissenting voices. The laments of Jeremiah, once treasonous, are compiled into a sacred text that becomes central to Jewish and Christian identity, teaching generations about the consequences of breaking a covenant with God. The community essentially mines its own historical failure for moral instruction, transforming its greatest shame into its most enduring lesson. Second, these legends provide a sense of continuity and identity. By venerating a prophet they once exiled, the community tells a story about its own capacity for growth and redemption. It can say, "We once made a terrible error, but we have learned from it. We are the people who now honor the one we wronged." This creates a powerful, if somewhat self-serving, narrative of moral progress. The dangerous, unpredictable power of live prophecy is thus domesticated. It is taken off the unpredictable streets and placed safely inside the covers of a book, the lines of a poem, or the ritual of a holiday, where its meaning can be controlled, interpreted by priests and scholars, and presented to the public in a manageable, non-threatening dose. There is a deep irony in this process, however. The very act of canonizing the prophet often strips their message of its original disruptive power. The fiery, specific condemnation of a corrupt king becomes a generalized lesson about the dangers of power. The urgent warning about a particular social injustice is softened into a vague plea for kindness. The prophet, who was a radical in their own time, is often transformed into a conservative figure in legend, their words used to uphold the very traditions they might have challenged. Think of how the radical teachings of Jesus, which challenged the religious and political authorities of his day, were, within centuries, institutionalized as the state religion of the Roman Empire. The revolutionary becomes the foundation of a new establishment. This is the ultimate neutralization of the dangerous truth-teller. By turning them into a saint, we sand down their sharp edges. By celebrating their martyrdom, we avoid confronting the ongoing relevance of their message. We build statues to them so we don't have to become what they demanded us to be. The transformation into legend is, in this light, a brilliant strategy of containment. It allows a society to acknowledge a difficult truth from its past while effectively ensuring that no new, living prophet with a similarly disruptive message will be taken quite as seriously again, because we can always point to the legend and say, "We have already learned that lesson." We honor the dead prophet precisely so we can ignore the living one. Now we must confront a striking and undeniable pattern that runs through these stories, a thread that connects the fates of Cassandra, the Sibyl, and so many others. A remarkable number of history's most famous exiled prophets were women. This is not a coincidence. To fully understand their plight, we have to view their journeys through the lens of gender, recognizing that in the rigidly patriarchal societies of the ancient world, a woman's voice claiming ultimate, divine authority was not just unusual, it was a seismic event that threatened the very foundations of the social order. A man delivering a prophecy could be seen as a wise counselor or a political rival, but a woman speaking with the voice of a god was a profound anomaly, a paradox that placed her in an impossibly precarious position. Her power was simultaneously revered as a sacred, otherworldly gift and deeply feared as something unnatural, even monstrous. This precarious status meant that when the political winds shifted, the fall of a prophetess was not merely a rejection of her message, but very often a punishment for her gender, a brutal reassertion of control over a woman who had dared to step far outside the boundaries prescribed for her. Consider the double bind that trapped these women from the very beginning. In a culture where women were largely expected to be silent in public spheres, obedient to male guardians, and confined to domestic roles, the female prophet occupied a uniquely contradictory space. She was granted a temporary, ritualized exemption from these norms. The Pythia at Delphi, for instance, was often an older woman from a local village, but when she sat on the tripod, breathing the sacred vapors, she was no longer seen as a mere woman. She became the god Apollo's vessel, and her voice, however fragmented, could command kings and halt armies. This temporary authority was tolerated precisely because it was framed as a form of divine possession. The community could tell itself that it was not a woman ruling over men, but a god using a female body as a passive instrument. The moment that illusion was threatened, the moment her prophecies became too politically inconvenient or her personal authority too great, the tolerated exception swiftly became a dangerous aberration. The very mechanism that allowed her to speak with power, the idea of possession, could be instantly flipped to become an accusation. Was it a god speaking through her, or was it a demon? Was it divine inspiration, or was it hysteria, that ancient diagnosis for a woman's body and mind supposedly running out of control? This is precisely why the accusations leveled against a fallen prophetess so often carried a distinctly gendered venom. When a male prophet was discredited, he might be called a fraud or a traitor. But when a woman faced the same fate, the charges were frequently layered with misogynistic stereotypes designed to undermine not just her message, but her very being. She was labeled a hysteric, her legitimate divine ecstasy recast as the irrational ravings of an unbalanced female mind. We see this clearly in the treatment of Cassandra. The Trojans did not simply disagree with her, they called her mad, dismissing her accurate foretellings as the nonsensical outbursts of a woman out of control. This was a powerful way to neutralize her. By pathologizing her speech, they could ignore its content. Alternatively, a prophetess might be branded a witch or a sorceress, her power attributed not to a legitimate god but to dark, illicit pacts with chthonic forces. This accusation of witchcraft was particularly effective because it played on deep-seated fears of female sexuality and knowledge that existed outside male-controlled religious institutions. It suggested her power was not only false but actively malevolent, a corrupting influence that required eradication. Perhaps the most insidious accusation was that of the seductress. If a prophetess's influence could not be explained by madness or witchcraft, it might be attributed to her using her feminine wiles to manipulate men. This charge stripped her authority of any spiritual or intellectual basis and reduced it to a form of sexual deception. It allowed the powerful men she challenged to save face. They could argue they weren't defeated by a woman's superior insight or connection to the divine, but merely tricked by her cunning and allure. This was a way of reasserting patriarchal control by framing the entire relationship in terms of a familiar dynamic, the dangerous, tempting woman leading men astray. All of these accusations, the hysteric, the witch, the seductress, served the same ultimate purpose. They provided a socially acceptable pretext for silencing a woman who had become too powerful. They allowed the community to rationalize its violence against her by transforming her from a respected seer into a monstrous perversion of ideal womanhood, someone whose very existence polluted the social and spiritual order, and whose exile was therefore not a tragedy, but a necessity. The exile of a prophetess, therefore, was far more than the removal of a troublesome individual. It was a public ritual designed to reinforce patriarchal norms and police the boundaries of acceptable female behavior. By casting out a woman who had wielded such extraordinary influence, the community was sending a clear message to all its members, especially its women. It demonstrated that there was a strict limit to female power, a ceiling that could not be breached without catastrophic consequences. A woman could be a vessel for the divine as long as she remained passive, her own identity erased. But the moment she was perceived as wielding that power actively, independently, or in a way that challenged male authority, the full force of social punishment would come down upon her. Her banishment was a spectacle that served to restore the traditional hierarchy. It reassured the men in power that the natural order had been re-established. It showed that the anomaly had been corrected and that women, even the most gifted, ultimately belonged to the private, silent sphere, not the public, authoritative one. The journey from oracle to outcast for these women was thus a gendered tragedy, a stark reminder that their prophetic gift was never truly theirs to own, but only to borrow under the strictest and most precarious of conditions, a loan that could be called in at any moment, with interest paid in the currency of exile and scorn. Imagine being cast out from the bustling heart of a city, from the familiar sounds of the marketplace and the protective shadow of its walls, and being forced to walk into the vast, silent emptiness of the desert. This was the fate of many an exiled prophet, and the landscape they were sent to was never chosen at random. The physical location of banishment was a profound, symbolic extension of their punishment, a place that mirrored the nature of their transgression and the community's deepest fears. When a society exiles its truth-tellers, it doesn't just push them beyond a geographical boundary. It consigns them to a realm of potent symbolism where the very earth and sky seem to comment on their fate. The desert, the mountain, and the untamed wilderness were not just backdrops for these dramas of downfall. They were active, almost sentient characters in the story, each representing a different facet of what it meant to be cast out from the human world and forced to confront the raw, unforgiving power of nature and the divine. Consider first the desert, that immense and sun-scorched expanse of sand and stone. In the ancient imagination, the desert was the ultimate symbol of purification and emptiness. It was a blank slate, a place where the complexities and corruptions of city life were burned away by a relentless sun and scoured by howling winds. Sending a prophet to the desert was a way of saying, "You have polluted our community with your dangerous truths. Now go to a place of absolute purity and be cleansed." It was a landscape of radical simplification, where survival depended on the most basic elements: finding water, seeking shade, enduring the searing heat of day and the biting cold of night. For the prophet, this was a brutal return to the fundamentals of existence. Stripped of their audience, their temple, and their social role, they were left with nothing but their own thoughts and the vast, indifferent horizon. This environment of extreme hardship was meant to break them, to force a contemplation so deep it bordered on annihilation. Yet, in a powerful irony, the desert was also the traditional birthplace of revelation. It was in the desolate wilderness that Moses encountered the burning bush, and where John the Baptist lived on locusts and wild honey, hearing the voice of God in the silence. The community, in its attempt to purify itself by casting out the prophet, often inadvertently returned them to the very conditions that fostered prophetic power in the first place, creating a cruel paradox where the punishment mirrored the origin of the crime. Then there is the mountain, a landscape of a completely different character but equally rich in symbolic meaning. If the desert represented horizontal emptiness, the mountain represented vertical isolation and a dangerous closeness to the divine. To be exiled to a mountain was to be physically elevated above the world of men, separated from the community not by vast distances of sand, but by sheer, impassable cliffs and thin, difficult-to-breathe air. This was a solitude of altitude, a sentence to live among the clouds in the domain of eagles and storms. Mountains were universally seen as the dwelling places of the gods, Olympus for the Greeks, Sinai for the Hebrews, Meru for the Hindus. By banishing a prophet to a mountain, the community was effectively saying, "You claim such a close connection to the divine, then go live with them. Let's see how you fare in their direct, untempered presence." It was a test of the prophet's authenticity, a dare thrown down by a skeptical society. Could they truly survive in the realm of the gods, or would they perish in the attempt, proving their visions to be nothing but hollow boasts? This form of exile was particularly suited for prophets accused of hubris, of overstepping the boundary between mortal and divine. The mountain became both their prison and their podium, a place of immense suffering but also of unparalleled perspective, from which they could look down upon the city that rejected them, a tiny, ordered speck in the chaotic tapestry of the world below. Beyond these two stark environments lies a third, more nebulous space, the wilderness, the deep forest, or the tangled marsh. This is the liminal space, the threshold between the known world and utter chaos. Unlike the pure emptiness of the desert or the divine order of the mountain peak, the wilderness is a place of confusion, transformation, and raw, untamed life. Here paths disappear, the sun is blocked by a dense canopy, and strange sounds echo in the twilight. This was the realm of monsters and spirits, a place where the normal rules of civilization simply did not apply. Sending a prophet into this green, shifting maze was a way of returning them to a primordial state of nature, a world before laws, before cities, before order. It symbolized that the prophet's message was so chaotic, so disruptive to the social fabric, that they themselves belonged to the world of chaos. The forest was a place of metamorphosis, where identities could be lost and reshaped. A prophet exiled here might be seen as descending into madness, or conversely, they might emerge with an even more profound and terrifying wisdom, having confronted the raw, unconscious mind of the world itself. This landscape was a perfect mirror for prophets whose messages dealt with hidden sins, repressed desires, or the unsettling truth that civilization is only a thin veneer over a much wilder, more primal reality. The choice of landscape was a deliberate message from the community, a final, symbolic judgment on the prophet's crime. A prophet who challenged the political order, who threatened the king's legitimacy, might be sent to the desert, a place of emptiness that reflected the political vacuum they were accused of creating. A prophet who claimed direct, unmediated access to the gods, who seemed to challenge the authority of the established priesthood, would be a prime candidate for the mountain, forced to prove their connection in the most direct way possible. And a prophet whose message revealed the hidden chaos and moral rot festering beneath the city's polished surface. They would be cast into the chaotic wilderness, the living embodiment of the disorder they claimed to see. The geography of exile was a language in itself, a brutal poetry that spelled out the reasons for banishment in the grammar of rock, sand, and tree. It was the community's way of inscribing its verdict not on a scroll, but on the very face of the earth, ensuring that the prophet's punishment would be a daily, physical reminder of their transgression, written in a language they could not escape, a language of thirst, of vertigo, and of fear in the deepening dark. But the most desolate wilderness a prophet could ever face was not a windswept desert or a remote mountain peak. It was the vast, echoing emptiness within their own mind. Physical banishment was a public spectacle, a visible punishment for all to see. Yet, for the prophet themselves, the journey into the outer wasteland was often just the final, external manifestation of an inner exile that had already begun. Imagine the profound psychological torment of having dedicated your entire life to being a clear, flawless channel for divine truth, only to be declared a fraud by the very community you were born to serve. After years of speaking with an authority that moved armies and anointed kings, to be met not with reverence but with ridicule, not with awe but with accusations of madness, could not help but create a seismic crisis of faith and identity. The most haunting question, the one that must have echoed in the silent moments between their footsteps on the road to banishment, is a simple one: did they ever doubt themselves? Having been told their entire life that their visions came from an infallible source, to be so violently rejected by the world might have planted a seed of terrible uncertainty. Was it possible that the priests and the king were right? Could the ecstatic trances, the vivid dreams, the commanding voices, could it all have been a grand delusion, a trick of the mind amplified by the expectations of a superstitious society? This internal conflict is the least documented but perhaps the most agonizing part of their journey, a private battle waged in the theater of a single, tormented soul far from any witnessing eyes. This loneliness was of a unique and piercing quality. It wasn't merely the solitude of being alone, it was the profound isolation of being the only person in the world who knows a terrible, world-shattering truth. Picture Cassandra not just as a princess trapped within the walls of Troy, but as a consciousness trapped within a nightmare no one else could perceive. She didn't just suspect danger, she knew with absolute, gut-wrenching certainty that the wooden horse was a trick and that her entire world was about to be consumed by fire and blood. Every laugh from her family, every celebration in the streets, every moment of normalcy was a brutal confirmation of her separation from them. She was an island of horrific knowledge in a sea of blissful ignorance, and the curse ensured that no bridge could ever be built between them. This is a form of psychological banishment more complete than any physical expulsion. To be surrounded by people yet utterly unable to connect, to scream a warning that is heard only as meaningless noise, is to be imprisoned in a glass box, watching the world rush toward a cliff, your fists pounding on an invisible, unbreakable barrier. The scorn of the community, the mocking laughter, the dismissive labels of madwoman or hysteric were not just insults, they were the nails sealing the lid on this internal coffin, confirming that her reality and theirs would forever be irreconcilable. For prophets who derived their power from a specific deity, this rejection could spiral into an even deeper spiritual crisis, a feeling of being abandoned by the very gods they served. Consider the plight of a prophet like Jeremiah. He didn't just believe he was interpreting signs, he was convinced he was delivering the direct, uncompromising words of Yahweh himself. He endured beatings, imprisonment, and social ostracism for decades, all out of a steadfast commitment to this divine calling. But in his lowest moments, recorded in the book that bears his name, we hear a voice that is anything but confident. He cries out to God in anguish, accusing the divine of having deceived him and of having become like a deceitful brook, like waters that fail. This is the raw sound of a prophet's internal exile. The external world has rejected his message, and now, in his profound isolation, he begins to wonder if the source of that message has abandoned him too. Has the divine connection, the very core of his identity, been severed? Was his entire life of suffering and sacrifice built upon a lie, or worse, a divine betrayal? This is the ultimate psychological torment for a truth teller. The terrifying suspicion that the truth they have been serving might not be there at all, leaving them utterly alone in a meaningless universe, their life's work rendered a cruel joke. This internal landscape of doubt and isolation adds a crucial layer of tragic depth to these mythic figures, transforming them from two-dimensional archetypes into profoundly relatable human beings. Their suffering was not merely the external punishment inflicted upon them by a vengeful king or a fickle mob. The deepest wounds were often self-inflicted by a mind wrestling with impossible questions in the crushing silence of its own exile. It reminds us that the journey from Oracle to Outcast was not just a physical trek across a map, but a harrowing descent into the deepest valleys of the human psyche, where the greatest battle was not against the gods at the city gate, but against the whispering voices of uncertainty within. Their external banishment was a sentence passed by society, but their internal exile was a prison they were forced to build and inhabit themselves, brick by painful brick, with every moment of disbelief they endured and every flicker of doubt they were forced to confront alone. With the prophet finally cast out beyond the city walls, a palpable, uneasy silence would often descend upon the community. The immediate threat was gone, the troublesome voice silenced, but a lingering sense of spiritual contamination remained, a psychic residue that demanded removal. The act of exile alone was not enough to restore the delicate balance that had been shattered. To truly heal the social body and close this painful chapter, the community would engage in a series of formal, often elaborate, rituals of cleansing. These ceremonies were far more than simple celebrations. They were a form of collective therapy, a carefully choreographed performance designed to purify the city, absolve the populace of guilt, and symbolically reboot the community's relationship with the divine. Imagine the scene, the day after a prophet like Jeremiah was dragged away or a seer was formally banished. The priests would orchestrate a grand sacrifice at the main temple. The air, once filled with the prophet's warnings, would now be thick with the smoke of burning fat and flesh, a pleasing aroma offered up to the gods as a way of saying, "See." We have corrected our error, the impurity is gone, favor us once more. This was not an act of mourning, but one of erasure. The goal was to wash away the memory and the perceived spiritual pollution the truth-teller had introduced, allowing everyone to collectively pretend the uncomfortable episode had never happened, restoring a fragile and comforting illusion of order. These purification rituals took many forms, each meticulously designed to address a different facet of the communal wound. One of the most common was the sacrificial offering, often of a specific, symbolic animal. In the ancient Greek world, this could involve a bull, a creature of immense value and strength. Its blood spilled to appease the gods and cleanse the polis of the miasma, the spiritual stain, left by the prophet's presence. The choice of animal was never arbitrary. A black sheep or goat might be chosen for a chthonic deity, an offering to the underworld powers to take back the dark influence of the exiled seer. The ritual would be public and spectacular, a vivid sensory experience for all to witness. The priests, in their finest robes, would lead the ceremony, chanting specific hymns of purification as the animal was slaughtered. The people, gathered in the main square, would not just watch, they would participate, perhaps by throwing a handful of grain onto the altar, or by joining in a final, cathartic shout as the fire consumed the offering. This shared act created a powerful bond, a collective sigh of relief that transformed their individual anxieties into a unified sense of resolution. It was a physical, visceral way of drawing a line under the event, a public declaration that the source of the divine displeasure had been identified, removed, and now atoned for. Beyond sacrifice, communities might institute new festivals or repurpose old ones to mark this new beginning. A city that had exiled a prophet for predicting its downfall might establish an annual festival of renewal, or the feast of the city's preservation. During this festival, the story of the prophet would be retold, but with a crucial twist. The narrative would be framed to highlight the wisdom of the king and the priests in recognizing the fraud and saving the people from deception. The prophet would be cast as a villain in a civic drama, a necessary antagonist whose defeat proved the strength and virtue of the community. There would be processions, feasting, and perhaps even a mock battle where a figure representing the exiled seer was symbolically driven out of the city once more. This annual reenactment served to cement the official version of events in the cultural memory, ensuring that with each passing generation, the prophet's true message was further diluted and their legacy was firmly established as one of dangerous falsehood, not inconvenient truth. It was a way of using celebration to enforce forgetfulness, turning a moment of collective failure into a cornerstone of civic pride. Perhaps the most enduring form of this cleansing, however, was architectural. A powerful way to assert that a new era had begun was to literally build over the old one. If a prophet had operated from a particular grove, cave, or shrine, that place might be systematically dismantled. Its sacred stones would be toppled, its trees cut down, and its altar defiled. Then, on that very same spot, a new temple to the state-approved god would be erected, or a monument to the ruling king would be raised. This was a profound act of symbolic replacement. The physical space once associated with dissent and dangerous truths was now reconsecrated to the powers that be. Every citizen who walked past this new structure would receive a silent, powerful message. The old ways are gone, the old voice is silenced, and the authority you see before you in stone and mortar is the only legitimate authority. In some cases, the cleansing extended to the legal code itself. A ruler might promulgate new laws specifically forbidding the types of practices the exiled prophet was accused of: ecstatic trances, unapproved divination, or speaking against the crown. These laws served a dual purpose. They prevented the rise of a new, similar figure, and they provided a legal and moral framework that retroactively justified the exile, framing it not as an act of political suppression, but as a necessary step to uphold divine and civic order. Through these physical and legal transformations, the community literally reshaped its environment to reflect the new reality it wished to inhabit, one where the prophet's voice was not just absent, but rendered unimaginable. The ultimate psychological purpose of all these rituals, the sacrifices, the festivals, the new buildings, was to facilitate a collective act of what we might now call motivated forgetting. By uniting in these cleansing ceremonies, the community could achieve a powerful catharsis. The complex, messy, and morally ambiguous reality of the prophet's exile, the possibility that they might have been right, the nagging guilt over their mistreatment, could be washed away in a wave of ritualized certainty. The group could collectively agree, we were polluted and now we are clean, we were threatened and now we are safe, we were divided and now we are one. This restored social harmony, but it was a harmony built on a foundation of deliberate ignorance. It reinforced the power of the ruling authority by demonstrating its role as the sole arbiter between the people and the divine, the only entity capable of diagnosing spiritual sickness and prescribing the cure. The rituals of cleansing were the final, crucial step in the social function of exile. They transformed the act of casting out a member from a traumatic rupture into a reaffirming rite of passage. They allowed the community to define itself not by the difficult truths it contained, but by the enemies it had successfully expelled, using the memory of the outcast as the mortar to rebuild the walls of its own, more comfortable and far more fragile identity. Yet for all the tragic tales of banishment and silencing, the story of prophecy is not written entirely in the language of exile. There exists a compelling counter-narrative, a less dramatic but equally vital thread woven through history and myth, where the prophet's voice was not only heard but actively sought, heeded, and integrated into the very fabric of power. These rare instances where a seer successfully navigated the treacherous waters between divine insight and earthly authority reveal a crucial truth. The fate of a prophet was not always sealed from the start. It hinged on a delicate, often fleeting, alignment of three critical elements: a message that resonated rather than repelled, a messenger whose credibility was beyond reproach, and a cultural moment ripe for their specific brand of truth. Examining these successful prophets does not diminish the tragedies of the Cassandras and Jeremiahs. Instead, it deepens our understanding of their plight by showing us the precise conditions that, when absent, made their exile almost inevitable. Consider the profound influence of the prophet Samuel in the early history of ancient Israel. His story stands in stark contrast to the later Hebrew prophets who faced persecution. Samuel operated during a transitional period, a time when the loose confederation of Israelite tribes was moving toward a centralized monarchy. His role was not one of an outsider shouting warnings from the wilderness. He was the central religious and judicial authority of the land, traveling a circuit to judge the people. When the people demanded a king to lead them like other nations, it was Samuel whom they approached. God, according to the biblical narrative, instructed Samuel to anoint Saul and later David as the first kings of Israel. Here, the prophet's message was one of divine endorsement for a political transformation the people themselves were already clamoring for. Samuel was not introducing a disruptive, unwanted truth. He was sanctifying a popular political aspiration, using his prophetic authority to legitimize a new form of government and the individuals who would lead it. His power was immense because it served a unifying, nation-building purpose. He was heeded because his prophecies confirmed the community's existing desires and provided a sacred framework for their fulfillment, seamlessly blending the divine will with the popular will. Similarly, the oracle at Delphi, for all its famous ambiguities, enjoyed centuries of immense prestige and influence precisely because its pronouncements so often aligned with the pragmatic needs and existing worldviews of its consultants. City-states did not pilgrimage to Delphi seeking to have their entire way of life overturned. They went for specific, practical guidance that could be integrated into their strategic planning. A famous example is the oracle's advice to the Athenians during the Persian Wars. When the Athenian envoys, fearing the imminent invasion of Xerxes's colossal army, sought Apollo's guidance, the Pythia initially delivered a terrifying prophecy of doom, speaking of walls of wood and a destroyed city. This was a classic unwelcome truth, and the Athenians, to their credit, persisted. They returned, pleading for a better answer. The subsequent prophecy, which famously advised trusting in the wooden wall, was ambiguous but ultimately constructive. The Athenian leader Themistocles interpreted the wooden wall to mean their navy, an interpretation that aligned perfectly with his own strategic vision and the city's maritime strengths. The resulting victory at the Battle of Salamis was a legendary triumph, and Delphi's reputation was burnished to a brilliant shine. The oracle was heeded because its cryptic message could be interpreted in a way that confirmed an existing, viable strategy. It offered a solution that required immense courage and sacrifice, yes, but not a fundamental reordering of Athenian identity or values. The prophecy provided a divine spark, but it was the Athenians' own ingenuity and pre-existing military capacity that provided the fuel for their salvation. The conditions for a prophet's acceptance become even clearer when we examine the nature of the messages that were welcomed versus those that were rejected. A prophecy that confirms a community's foundational myths or flatters its self-image is far more likely to be embraced. Imagine a seer in a warrior culture foretelling a great victory. Their words will be met with cheers and celebration. The prophecy reinforces the community's core identity as strong and destined for glory. Conversely, a prophecy that forces a community to confront its own moral failings, its hidden corruption, or its structural injustices presents a direct threat to its collective ego. The message of a Jeremiah demanding social justice and condemning hollow ritual required a painful introspection and a fundamental change in behavior that the powerful and the comfortable were unwilling to undertake. The successful prophet, therefore, often delivers a truth that the audience is already subconsciously prepared to hear, a truth that empowers rather than indicts, that builds up rather than tears down. Their success depends on telling people not what they need to hear, but what, on some deep level, they want to hear, provided it is framed within the acceptable language of divine sanction. This reveals the critical importance of the messenger's perceived credibility and their position within the established power structure. Samuel was not a lone voice from the desert. He was the recognized judge of all Israel. The Pythia spoke from within the most prestigious religious institution in the Greek world. Their authority was institutionalized, their platform provided by the very society they advised. A prophet operating outside these sanctioned channels, a nomadic voice like John the Baptist crying in the wilderness, or an independent visionary like Cassandra within the royal court, lacked this protective institutional armor. Their authority was personal and charismatic, making it inherently more fragile and threatening. A society is far more likely to heed a prophet who speaks from a position it has already deemed legitimate. The outsider, the freelance truth-teller, carries no such endorsement. Their power comes from a source that cannot be controlled by kings or priests, and is therefore viewed with suspicion, and when it becomes inconvenient, met with swift and decisive suppression. The integration of the prophet into the establishment is often the key to their survival, but it is also the very thing that can compromise the radical purity of their message, taming it into a tool for maintaining the status quo rather than a force for transforming it. The moment in history, the specific cultural and political context, is the final, volatile ingredient in this formula. A message of warning might be ignored in a time of peace and prosperity, only to be desperately sought after when plague strikes or enemy armies mass on the border. The same prophecy delivered by the same prophet can meet a completely different fate depending on the anxieties of the age. A society facing an existential threat is often more willing to listen to radical voices, to make sacrifices, and to believe in dire warnings because the alternative annihilation is even less palatable. However, this window of acceptance can be vanishingly short. Once the immediate crisis passes, the prophet whose grim predictions were temporarily heeded may quickly fall out of favor, their constant calls for vigilance and moral renewal now sounding like a tedious scold in a time of newfound comfort. The successful prophet, then, is not just a clear channel for divine truth, but a masterful reader of the cultural moment, someone whose message arrives with perfect timing, answering a question the community is already asking in a language it is prepared to understand. These rare cases of acceptance show us that the journey from oracle to outcast was never a foregone conclusion. It was a high-stakes negotiation between a voice speaking from the margins of the known and a world deciding whether to let that voice redefine its center, a negotiation whose outcome depended on a fragile and often temporary consensus that the truth being offered was, for that one precious moment, more valuable than the comfort it destroyed. And so we arrive at the final and perhaps most enduring destination in our journey, the legacy these exiled prophets carved into the very bedrock of our cultural memory. While their individual lives often ended in obscurity or tragedy, their collective stories refused to die. Instead, they were picked up by the currents of time, polished by retelling, and transformed into something far greater than the sum of their parts. They evolved into powerful archetypes, universal symbols that have come to represent the eternal struggle between the lone voice of conscience and the crushing weight of collective authority. The exiled prophet is no longer just Cassandra weeping for Troy or Jeremiah lamenting in his cistern. They have become the spiritual ancestor of the dissident artist whose work is censored, the scientist whose findings are suppressed, and the whistleblower whose life is dismantled for revealing an inconvenient truth. Their narrative provides a ready-made template, a kind of moral and psychological roadmap for understanding what it means to be persecuted for holding a vision that others refuse to see. In their ultimate failure, they achieved a paradoxical, posthumous victory, becoming a permanent, haunting presence in our collective imagination, a ghost that reminds us of the price of truth and the enduring power of a single, unwavering conscience. This legacy has fundamentally shaped our deepest concepts of justice and dissent. The prophet's story inverts the conventional narrative of their time. In the moment of exile, the society declares itself just and the prophet a criminal. But as the story is told and retold, a moral recalibration occurs. Over generations, the community that cast out the seer is often recast as the villain, arrogant, blind, and fearful, while the exiled individual is elevated to the status of a tragic hero. This narrative flip is not just a plot twist, it's a profound cultural mechanism for refining our understanding of justice itself. It teaches us that legal authority is not always moral authority, and that a verdict delivered by a king or a council can be the height of injustice when it serves to protect power rather than truth. The prophet's fate becomes a cautionary benchmark against which we measure our own societies. When we see a modern figure being ostracized for their beliefs, we instinctively reach for these ancient stories. We ask, is this a Cassandra moment? Are we playing the role of the ignorant Trojans, smugly celebrating our wooden horse while disaster lurks within? This archetypal framework provides the emotional and intellectual fuel for dissent. It gives courage to the resister by placing them in a noble, timeless lineage, assuring them that even in their isolation, they are part of a grand, historical tradition of truth-telling that, while often punished in the present, is frequently vindicated by the future. Consider how this archetype manifests in the figure of the artist. Throughout history, creators who have challenged societal norms have frequently faced a version of prophetic exile, their work banned, their reputation smeared, their ability to earn a living destroyed. The painter whose controversial masterpiece is removed from a gallery, the novelist whose book is burned for its political commentary, the musician whose songs are banned by a regime, all of them walk in the footsteps of the oracle who was silenced for delivering an unwelcome vision. Their art becomes their prophecy, a reflection of the world that is too critical, too raw, or too truthful for the public to comfortably digest. Society, in its role as the rejecting community, often dismisses them not as frauds, but as degenerates, corrupters of public morals, or purveyors of obscenity. Yet, just as with the ancient seers, time often performs a dramatic reversal. The very art that was once exiled from the cultural mainstream is later rediscovered, celebrated, and housed in the most revered museums, its creator posthumously hailed as a genius. This process demonstrates how the legacy of the prophet has taught us to be skeptical of immediate public reaction and to value the disruptive, uncomfortable voice of the artist as a vital force for cultural evolution and self-awareness. The same pattern holds true for the intellectual and the revolutionary. The scholar whose research upends a cherished dogma, whether in science, history, or economics, often faces a modern form of banishment from academic circles, their funding cut and their tenure denied. They are the Tiresias figures of our age, presenting evidence that challenges our foundational myths, only to be met with professional scorn and institutional exclusion. And the revolutionary, the figure who stands against an entire political system, embodies the most direct parallel to the prophet confronting a king. From figures like Mahatma Gandhi to Nelson Mandela, their journeys often involved imprisonment, exile, and vilification, the state's method of casting out the troublesome truth-teller. Yet their unwavering commitment to their cause, their willingness to endure isolation and punishment for their beliefs, is what ultimately galvanizes movements and topples empires. Their power is drawn from the same well as the prophets, an authority that comes not from worldly position, but from moral consistency and a profound connection to a truth that transcends the current political reality. We celebrate these figures today because the ancient stories of exiled prophets have helped to forge a cultural sensibility that is, in the long run, deeply suspicious of power and sympathetic to the courage of the individual who stands against it. The most telling sign of this cultural reckoning is the simple, powerful fact that we still tell these stories, and that we almost invariably tell them from the prophet's point of view. Our natural sympathy lies with the outcast, not the court. We are moved by Cassandra's futile warnings, not by King Priam's pragmatic dismissal. We admire Jeremiah's steadfastness, not the king's political maneuvering. This narrative alignment is a monumental shift from the values of the ancient world, where the stability of the state was often considered the highest good. It indicates that, as a culture, we have internalized the lesson of the exiled prophet. We have come to understand that a society's health is measured not by its ability to enforce conformity, but by its capacity to tolerate and even protect the disruptive voices in its midst. The continued retelling of these myths is a form of collective therapy, a way of rehearsing a better response to truth-tellers so that we might not repeat the mistakes of the past. It is our way of building a cultural immune system that can recognize the value of a critical, dissenting voice before it is too late. Ultimately, the legacy of the exiled prophet is a double-edged sword, serving as both a permanent cautionary tale and a timeless celebration. It is a cautionary tale for any society that becomes too comfortable, too sure of itself, too resistant to change. It warns us of the existential danger of silencing the voices that challenge our comfort, reminding us that a civilization that cannot hear its own flaws is a civilization already in decline. The fall of Troy is the classic metaphor here. A city that could not listen to its own seer was doomed to become a smoldering ruin, a lesson that echoes through the ages for any culture that prioritizes pride over prudence and conformity over critical self-examination. At the same time, this legacy is a radiant celebration of individual conscience. It affirms that one person's inner conviction, their commitment to a truth as they see it, can hold more weight than the decrees of an empire. It tells us that integrity is a form of power that cannot be taken away by exile, imprisonment, or death. The prophets' physical journey may end in the wilderness, but their moral journey continues through history, inspiring each new generation to question authority, to speak out against injustice, and to trust the quiet, insistent voice of their own conscience, especially when it stands alone against the world. But as we stand amidst the grand tapestry of these myths, a crucial question emerges from the shadows, one that asks us to separate the shimmering threads of legend from the sturdy fibers of historical fact. Were these exiled prophets, these Cassandras and Sibyls, real people who walked the earth, or are they purely fictional archetypes, beautiful inventions designed to explain the unexplainable? The answer, as it so often is, lies in a fascinating middle ground, a place where history provides the seed and imagination cultivates a magnificent, enduring tree. To truly appreciate the power of these stories, we must engage in a delicate act of excavation, carefully brushing away the accumulated layers of poetic embellishment to see what, if anything, lies at the core. This isn't an effort to debunk or diminish the myths, but rather to understand the very human process of how a person can be transformed into a symbol, and how a single life can be amplified over centuries into a timeless echo of our deepest fears and aspirations. Let's begin with a figure we know with a surprising degree of historical certainty, the Pythia of Delphi. Unlike the purely literary Cassandra, the Pythia was very much a real person, or more accurately, a real office held by a succession of women over many centuries. Archaeological evidence confirms the existence of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi as one of the most important religious sites in the ancient world. Historical records, including accounts by writers like Plutarch, who himself served as a priest at Delphi, describe the oracle's operation in detail. We know that the role was typically filled by an older woman from a local village, who would undergo specific purification rites before descending into the temple's inner chamber, the Addition. There, seated on a three-legged stool over a fissure in the earth, she would breathe in vapors now believed by some geologists to have been ethylene gas, a mild anesthetic and hallucinogen that rose from the bedrock, and enter an altered state of consciousness. Her utterances, often fragmented and ecstatic, would then be interpreted and versified by attending priests for the supplicants who sought her counsel. This is the historical bedrock, a real ritual in a real place performed by real women who held a uniquely powerful, state-sanctioned position in the ancient Mediterranean world. So how do we get from this historical reality to the archetype of the exiled prophet? The transformation occurs through the powerful engine of myth-making. While the Pythia as an institution was rarely, if ever, formally exiled, the stories about oracles and seers often revolved around themes of conflict and rejection. Historical events and political tensions were projected onto these figures, both real and imagined. For instance, the reputation of the Delphic oracle suffered significantly after the Persian Wars, when it was perceived as having given advice that was favorable to the invaders. This real-world political fallout, this erosion of trust in a once unimpeachable institution, provided fertile ground for storytellers. It's not difficult to see how a poet or playwright, reflecting on this loss of faith, might craft a narrative about a specific, fictional seer whose accurate but unwelcome warnings lead to their personal downfall. The historical anxiety of a community losing its spiritual compass becomes personified in the dramatic, individual tragedy of a single prophet. The real, complex political missteps of the Delphic priesthood are simplified and made more emotionally resonant through the story of a Cassandra, whose personal curse symbolizes the broader societal failure to listen. This process of embellishment also served to universalize very specific, local phenomena. The Pythia was a Greek institution, but the archetype of the truth-teller who is punished appears in cultures from Siberia to Mesoamerica. How does this happen? The specific historical details of the Pythia, the tripod, the vapors, the name Apollo are stripped away, leaving behind a powerful, skeletal plot. A person with access to hidden knowledge delivers a warning that threatens the powerful and is consequently cast out. This core narrative is then grafted onto different cultural stocks. A Siberian shaman might be the central figure, and the source of their power might be a spirit animal rather than a god, but the story's structure remains hauntingly familiar. The historical particularities are the unique carvings on a box. The archetypal story is the precious, universal human experience contained inside. The myth becomes a cultural container, a durable vessel that can be passed from one generation to the next, and from one culture to another, preserving and transmitting fundamental truths about the relationship between the individual and the group, between power and truth, and between the comfort of ignorance and the perilous burden of knowledge. Understanding this distinction between the historical and the mythological does not rob these stories of their power. It dramatically enriches it when we realize that the tale of Cassandra is not a literal report from Bronze Age Troy, but a profound exploration of psychological and social dynamics. Its relevance explodes. It is no longer just a story about one doomed princess. It becomes a timeless commentary on the agony of being disbelieved, on the frustration of possessing certainty in a world that values comfortable lies. The myth becomes a mirror held up not to a single historical moment, but to a recurring pattern in human psychology. We are all, in our own ways, both Cassandra and the Trojans, sometimes possessing a truth that others refuse to see, and at other times stubbornly refusing to see a truth that threatens our own worldview. The historical Pythia gives the archetype its anchor in reality, a touchstone that reminds us these stories emerged from genuine human attempts to interface with the divine and the unknown. The mythological archetype, however, is what allows the story to travel across time and space, speaking with undiminished force to a whistleblower in the 21st century with the same clarity it spoke to an Athenian playwright 2,500 years ago. This analytical perspective grants us the best of both worlds, the grounding satisfaction of evidence and the boundless, transformative power of imagination, allowing us to see these ancient narratives not as dead legends, but as living, breathing conversations about the eternal challenges of being human. The journey from Oracle to Outcast is one of the most enduring and poignant narratives in all of human mythology, a story that transcends its ancient origins to speak directly to the core of our modern condition. Throughout this exploration, we have traversed the entire arc of this profound transformation, witnessing the ascent from divine inspiration to the pinnacle of political influence, and then the devastating fall from revered seer to scorned exile. We have peeled back the layers of this tragic cycle, uncovering the powerful psychological, social, and political currents that conspire to silence the very voices a society once elevated. We have seen how a community's desperate craving for certainty can curdle into a terrified rejection of that same certainty when it arrives in an unwelcome form. We have watched the intricate dance of power where the prophet's influence becomes a threat to kings and priests alike, leading to accusations of fraud, blasphemy, and madness designed to dismantle their credibility. And we have stood witness to the profound social psychology of scapegoating, where the collective anxiety of a people is purged by casting out the individual who dares to embody their deepest fears. The stories of Cassandra forever howling her truths into a void of disbelief, of the Sibyl withering into a voice trapped in a jar as her immortality became her prison, and of Tiresias, the blind man who saw everything yet was shunned for his sight. These are not mere relics of a superstitious past. They are not simple fables to be filed away with other ancient curiosities. They are, in fact, brilliantly polished mirrors held up to our own contemporary struggles. They reflect our ongoing, deeply fraught relationship with truth, authority, and the immense courage it takes to truly listen to voices that disrupt our comfort and challenge our most cherished assumptions. In every modern whistleblower who is professionally destroyed for revealing corruption, we see the ghost of Jeremiah cast into his cistern. In every scientist whose dire warnings about environmental collapse are minimized and mocked for political or economic convenience, we hear the echo of Cassandra's cursed prophecies. In every activist artist whose work is censored because it makes a society confront its own injustices, we recognize the spirit of the wandering sage, speaking truth from the margins because they are no longer welcome at the center. Let these ancient tales, then, serve as a permanent and sobering reminder of the immense cost of truth. They teach us that insight, no matter how divine its origin or how accurate its vision, is fragile when it stands alone against the inertia of power and the comfort of the crowd. The peril lies not in the message itself, but in our collective instinct to silence the messenger, to shatter the mirror rather than face the unsettling reflection staring back at us. The most dangerous exile is not the one that banishes a person to a physical wilderness, but the one that exiles an inconvenient truth from our public consciousness, leaving us to navigate the world blinded by our own willful ignorance. The journey from Oracle to Outcast is ultimately a cautionary tale about the fragility of our own moral courage. It challenges us to ask ourselves a difficult question. In our own lives, in our own communities, are we playing the part of the enlightened society that heeds its Cassandras, or are we, like the citizens of Troy, too busy celebrating our own wooden horses to hear the warnings that could